Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're cracking open one of America's weirdest medical scandals, the time an entire nation got hooked on happy pills and nobody seemed to notice. The 1950s and 60s, that golden age of backyard barbecues, pristine suburbs, and mass pharmaceutical dependency. Yeah, turns out those picture-perfect housewives and hard-working husbands were popping tranquilizers like breath mints. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you're into these deep dives and drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? I want to know who's joining me on this trip through America's forgotten drug epidemic. Now dim those lights, get comfortable and settle in. We're about to explore how millions of Americans became guinea pigs in one of history's largest unplanned experiments in chemical mood control. Ready? Let's go. So picture this. It's 1903, and German scientists at the biopharmaceutical company are absolutely thrilled about their latest discovery. They've been tinkering with barbituric acid derivatives in their laboratory, and they've stumbled upon something they believe will revolutionize medicine. The compound they've created, which they'll eventually market under the name Veronal, seems to have an almost magical ability to calm anxious patients and help insomniacs finally get some rest. These chemists had no earthly idea that they were about to kick off a pharmaceutical saga that would span half a century and leave millions of people struggling with addiction, withdrawal, and, in far too many cases, accidental death. Not exactly the legacy they had in mind when they were celebrating in that German laboratory, but history has a funny way of taking our best intentions and running them through the ringer. To truly understand the tranquilizer epidemic of the 1950s and 60s, we need to first travel back to this earlier era, the age of barbiturates. These drugs dominated American medicine for roughly 3 decades, from the 1920s through the early 1950s, and their story is crucial because it sets the stage for everything that came after. The barbiturate era was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for the tranquilizer phenomenon, complete with overprescription, addiction crises, celebrity deaths, and a medical establishment that was remarkably slow to recognize the dangers of the drugs they were handing out like candy. The tranquilizers of the 1950s didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were specifically created to replace barbiturates, which had become so problematic that doctors were desperate for safer alternatives. So if we're going to understand why millions of Americans became dependent on Miltown and Valium, we first need to understand why they were taking barbiturates in the first place, and why those drugs turned out to be such a spectacular disaster. The story of barbiturates begins in 1864, when a German chemist named Adolf von Baeyer synthesized barbituric acid for the first time. Now, von Baeyer himself never intended for his discovery to become a medical compound. He was just doing basic chemistry research. According to one popular legend, he named the substance after a woman named Barbara, possibly a waitress at the tavern where he celebrated his discovery. Another story suggests he named it after St. Barbara's Day, which happened to be when he made his breakthrough. Either way, the name stuck, and barbituric acid itself turned out to be pharmacologically inert, meaning it didn't actually do anything useful in the human body. It would take another 4 decades before scientists figured out how to modify the molecule into something that could actually affect the nervous system. That breakthrough came in the early 1900s, when chemists discovered that by adding certain chemical groups to the barbituric acid molecule, they could create compounds with powerful sedative and hypnotic effects. The first of these to reach the market was barbital, sold as Veronal by Bayer beginning in 1903. Phenobarbital followed in 1912, marketed under the trade name Luminal. These early barbiturates were hailed as wonder drugs. Finally, doctors had reliable medications that could help patients with insomnia, anxiety, epilepsy, and a host of other conditions. The medical profession embraced these new compounds with open arms, and why wouldn't they? Before barbiturates, doctors had limited options for treating nervous conditions: alcohol, opium, chloral hydrate, and bromides, all of which had serious problems of their own. Barbiturates seemed like a genuine step forward, offering predictable effects at standardized doses. The fact that these drugs came in convenient pill form rather than requiring injections or liquid preparations made them even more appealing. Doctors could simply write a prescription, patients could take their medication at home, and everyone seemed happy. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turned out, quite a lot could go wrong, and quite a lot did go wrong over the next several decades. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the early days, barbiturates genuinely seemed like medical miracles. They worked rapidly, they were effective, and they gave doctors a sense of control over conditions that had previously been difficult to treat. By the 1920s, barbiturates had become firmly established in American medicine, and pharmaceutical companies were eager to expand their market. New barbiturate compounds proliferated rapidly. Amobarbital came along in 1923, pentobarbital in 1930, secobarbital in 1930. Each new formulation offered slightly different characteristics in terms of how quickly it acted and how long its effects lasted. Short-acting barbiturates were ideal for helping people fall asleep, while longer-acting versions could provide anxiety relief throughout the day. This variety gave doctors tremendous flexibility in their prescribing, which sounds like a good thing until you realize that it also meant there were now dozens of different barbiturates on the market, each with its own potential for misuse and abuse. The 1920s saw barbiturate use expand far beyond the treatment of serious medical conditions. Doctors began prescribing these drugs for everyday nervousness, mild anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and what we might today call stress. The medical profession of this era operated under very different standards than what we're accustomed to today. There were no randomized controlled trials, no long-term safety studies, no systematic tracking of adverse effects. Doctors relied on their clinical judgment and the marketing materials provided by pharmaceutical companies. If a drug seemed to work and patients weren't immediately dying, it was considered safe enough to prescribe freely. This meant that by the late 1920s, barbiturates were being handed out for all sorts of conditions that probably didn't require such powerful medication. Got butterflies before a big presentation? Here's some phenobarbital. Trouble sleeping because you've been drinking too much coffee? Try some secobarbital. Feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of modern life? Barbiturates to the rescue. The medical establishment had essentially decided that chemical sedation was an appropriate response to the ordinary stresses of human existence, a mindset that would prove remarkably persistent throughout the 20th century. The pharmaceutical companies were more than happy to encourage this expansive prescribing. Their marketing materials emphasized the safety and effectiveness of barbiturates, while downplaying any potential risks. Advertisements in medical journals depicted calm, contented patients who had found relief through these wonder drugs. The message was clear. Barbiturates were safe, effective, and appropriate for a wide range of conditions. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe them generously, and patients were happy to take them. By the early 1930s, barbiturate sales were booming, and the drugs had become deeply embedded in American medicine. Millions of prescriptions were being written annually, and barbiturates had achieved the status of household medications, as familiar and seemingly innocuous as aspirin. But cracks were beginning to show in this pharmaceutical fairy tale. By the mid-1930s, reports of barbiturate addiction were becoming impossible to ignore. Patients who had been taking these drugs for extended periods were discovering that they couldn't simply stop without experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. And we're not talking about mild discomfort here. Barbiturate withdrawal could be genuinely life-threatening. Patients attempting to quit after prolonged use could experience seizures, delirium, hallucinations, and in severe cases, death. The withdrawal from barbiturates was actually more dangerous than withdrawal from opiates, though this fact wasn't widely recognized at the time. Doctors were beginning to see patients who had become completely dependent on their barbiturate prescriptions, unable to function without their daily doses yet experiencing serious health problems as a result of continued use. The situation was made worse by the fact that barbiturates had an extremely narrow therapeutic window. This means that the difference between a dose that produces the desired calming effect and a dose that causes serious harm is relatively small. A patient who had developed tolerance to barbiturates and needed increasingly higher doses to achieve the same effect was playing a dangerous game. Take too little, and you don't get relief from your anxiety or insomnia. Take too much and you might stop breathing. This narrow margin made barbiturates particularly dangerous for people who were using them regularly, especially those who might have also been drinking alcohol or taking other medications. The combination of barbiturates and alcohol was especially deadly, as both substances depress the central nervous system, and their effects compound each other in unpredictable ways. Accidental overdoses began mounting throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Some were genuinely accidental. Patients who had taken their regular dose forgot they'd already done so and took another, or people who combined their barbiturates with alcohol and ended up taking a lethal combination. Others were semi-intentional, cases where people were using the drugs to escape from emotional pain and miscalculated how much they could safely take. And then there were the clear suicides, cases where people deliberately took massive overdoses of barbiturates to end their lives. The drug's easy availability and lethal potential made them a common choice for suicide, and coroners across the country were seeing increasing numbers of barbiturate-related deaths. The problem extended beyond addiction and overdose. Long-term barbiturate use was associated with a whole constellation of unpleasant effects. Patients often experienced persistent drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, slurred speech, and impaired coordination. These weren't minor inconveniences. They affected people's ability to work, drive safely, and function in their daily lives. Chronic barbiturate users often appeared drunk, even when they hadn't touched alcohol. Their judgment was impaired, their reaction times slowed, their thinking foggy. For a medication that was supposed to help people cope with life's challenges, barbiturates often ended up making those challenges considerably worse. But by the time these effects became apparent, patients were often so dependent on the drugs that stopping wasn't really an option without medical intervention. The 1940s brought the problem into sharper focus, partly because World War II created new contexts for barbiturate use and abuse. Military physicians prescribed these drugs to soldiers suffering from combat stress, anxiety, and insomnia. The drugs were also used as surgical anesthetics and in various other military medical applications. After the war, many veterans returned home with barbiturate dependencies they'd developed during their service. Civilian use continued to climb as well, fueled by the anxieties of wartime and the stresses of post-war readjustment. The pharmaceutical companies continued their aggressive marketing, and doctors continued their liberal prescribing. By the late 1940s, barbiturates were being produced by the ton, and Americans were consuming them at unprecedented rates. Medical journals began publishing case reports and studies documenting the dangers of barbiturate dependency. These publications described patients who had become completely enslaved to their prescriptions, unable to function without their daily doses yet suffering serious health consequences from continued use. The withdrawal syndrome was described in increasingly alarming terms, with physicians noting the seizures, psychosis, and potential for death that could accompany abrupt cessation. Some doctors called for tighter controls on barbiturate prescribing, arguing that these were dangerous drugs that should be reserved for serious medical conditions. But these voices were in the minority. The mainstream medical establishment continued to view barbiturates as safe and effective when used as directed, essentially blaming patients for any problems that arose. If someone became addicted, it was because they had an addictive personality or had misused the medication. The idea that the drugs themselves might be inherently problematic was slow to gain traction. Hollywood brought the barbiturate problem into public consciousness in a way that medical journals never could. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, celebrity deaths and overdoses involving barbiturates made headlines. Judy Garland struggled publicly with barbiturate addiction, a dependency that had begun when studio executives gave her pills to control her weight and energy levels. Her story was heartbreaking. A talented young woman who had been essentially drugged by the system that was supposed to protect her, and who spent years battling the resulting addiction. Other stars faced similar struggles, and the entertainment press was full of stories about actors and actresses who had become dependent on sleeping pills and nerve medication. These weren't marginalized individuals or social outcasts. They were glamorous, successful people whose lives had been derailed by drugs that their doctors had assured them were perfectly safe. The case that really captured public attention, though, wouldn't come until 1962, when Marilyn Monroe died from a barbiturate overdose. Her death shocked the nation and sparked widespread discussion about the dangers of these drugs. But even before Monroe's death, the pattern was clear. Barbiturates had claimed the lives of numerous public figures and countless ordinary citizens. The drugs that had been marketed as safe solutions for modern anxiety had turned out to be deadly addictive substances that were destroying lives rather than improving them. By the early 1950s, the medical establishment was facing a dilemma. On one hand, there was clearly a massive demand for medications that could help people cope with anxiety and insomnia. The stresses of modern life, the lingering trauma of the war years, the pressures of post-war society, all of these factors contributed to a population that desperately wanted chemical relief from their mental anguish. On the other hand, the primary drugs available for this purpose, barbiturates, were proving to be dangerous in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The drugs were addictive, they had a narrow therapeutic window that made overdose easy, they impaired cognitive function, and they interacted dangerously with alcohol and other medications. Something had to change. The pharmaceutical industry saw an enormous opportunity in this situation. If they could develop new drugs that offered the calming effects of barbiturates without the dangerous side effects, they would have a goldmine on their hands. The market was already established. Millions of Americans were taking barbiturates regularly, and they clearly weren't going to stop seeking chemical relief for their anxiety and insomnia. But if those millions could be switched to safer drugs, everyone would win. Patients would get relief without the risks, Doctors would have better tools for treating their patients, and pharmaceutical companies would have new products to sell. It was a win-win-win situation, at least in theory. This set the stage for one of the great pharmaceutical arms races of the 20th century. Researchers at major drug companies began working feverishly to discover compounds that could replace barbiturates. They were looking for drugs that would reduce anxiety without causing severe sedation, that wouldn't be addictive, that would have a wider therapeutic window to reduce the risk of overdose, and that wouldn't interact dangerously with alcohol. It was a tall order, but the potential rewards were enormous. The company that could crack this code would have access to a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. What's remarkable in retrospect is how the drug companies managed to maintain their credibility throughout this period. Here they were, having spent decades promoting barbiturates as safe and effective, now pivoting to develop replacements because barbiturates had turned out to be neither safe nor suitable for the purposes they'd been prescribed. You might think that this track record would have made doctors and patients skeptical of whatever new drugs came along. But pharmaceutical marketing is a powerful force, and the companies proved adept at repositioning themselves. The new narrative wasn't that they had been wrong about barbiturates. It was that medical science was advancing, and newer, better drugs were now available. The old drugs were fine for their time, but now we have something better. It was a clever spin that allowed them to maintain their authority while completely reversing their position. The period from roughly 1950 to 1955 represented a transitional moment in American psychopharmacology. Barbiturate prescriptions were still extremely high, but concerns about their safety were growing. Doctors were increasingly aware of the addiction potential and the risks of overdose, but they had few alternatives to offer their anxious patients. The demand for something new and safer was intense, both from the medical profession and from patients themselves. Into this void stepped a new class of drugs that promised to deliver all the benefits of barbiturates with none of the drawbacks. They were called tranquilizers, and they were about to change everything. The word tranquilizer itself is worth pausing on for a moment. It's a carefully chosen term that suggests peace, calm, serenity, a tranquil state of mind. The barbiturates were often called sedatives or hypnotics, terms that emphasize their sleep-inducing properties and their role as central nervous system depressants. But tranquilizers? That word suggested something gentler, more refined. You weren't being sedated or put to sleep. You were being tranquilized, brought to a state of peaceful calm while remaining alert and functional. It was brilliant marketing, really, a complete rebranding of the concept of chemical anxiety relief. Never mind that these new drugs would turn out to have their own serious problems. The terminology itself made them sound safer and more appealing than their predecessors. The first major breakthrough came in 1950, when a Czechoslovakian-born scientist named Frank Berger, working at a small pharmaceutical company called Carter Products in New Jersey, discovered the calming effects of a compound called meprobamate. Berger had actually been working on developing muscle relaxants, not anti-anxiety medications. He had synthesized meprobamate as part of this research and was testing it on laboratory animals. What he noticed was that the compound didn't just relax muscles, it also seemed to calm the animals without putting them to sleep. Mice that had been given meprobamate remained awake and active, but they were noticeably more tranquil, less reactive to stressful stimuli. This was different from what barbiturates did. Those drugs knocked animals out, made them sluggish and uncoordinated. Meprobamate, on the other hand, seemed to produce a calm alertness that was genuinely novel. Berger recognized the potential significance of his discovery. If this compound could calm animals without sedating them heavily, perhaps it could do the same for humans. And if it could do that, it might represent a genuine alternative to barbiturates, a drug that could relieve anxiety without causing the dangerous side effects that had made barbiturates so problematic. He began pushing for human trials, despite skepticism from some of his colleagues who thought the compound wasn't particularly interesting. Berger was convinced he was onto something important, and his persistence would eventually be vindicated in spectacular fashion. But we're getting ahead of our story. The meprobamate tale properly belongs to the next chapter, when we'll explore the rise of Milltown and the dawn of the tranquilizer age. For now, what's important to understand is that by the early 1950s, the stage was set for a pharmaceutical revolution. The barbiturate era had demonstrated both the enormous demand for anti-anxiety medications and the serious problems that could arise when such drugs were prescribed too freely. Millions of Americans had become dependent on barbiturates, and many had suffered serious consequences as a result. The medical establishment was desperate for safer alternatives, and the pharmaceutical industry was eager to provide them. The pieces were in place for the next act in America's ongoing love affair with psychotropic medications. What makes this history so relevant to understanding the tranquilizer epidemic is that almost none of the lessons from the barbiturate era were actually learned. Oh sure, the specific problems with barbiturates were recognized, their addictive potential, their narrow therapeutic window, their dangerous interactions with alcohol. But the broader patterns of prescribing behavior, the willingness to chemically manage everyday anxiety, the aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, the failure to conduct adequate long-term safety studies, none of these things changed with the introduction of tranquilizers. In fact, many of the same patterns would repeat themselves, just with different drugs and on an even larger scale. The barbiturate era also established important precedents for how Americans thought about mental health and chemical treatment. The idea that anxiety and nervousness were medical conditions that required pharmaceutical intervention had become deeply embedded in the culture. People who would never have considered taking drugs for ordinary worry in 1910 were routinely swallowing barbiturates by 1940. The concept of mother's little helper, a pill that could make the stresses of daily life more bearable, was already established before the first tranquilizer ever hit the market. This cultural shift made the eventual acceptance of tranquilizers much easier. Americans were already primed to view chemical solutions as appropriate responses to life's challenges. Similarly, the relationship between doctors and pharmaceutical companies had been thoroughly established during the barbiturate years. Drug companies marketed directly to physicians through journal advertisements, sales representatives, and free samples. Doctors relied on this information when making prescribing decisions, often without critically evaluating the claims being made. The companies presented their products in the most favorable light possible, emphasizing benefits while minimizing risks. This dynamic would persist throughout the tranquilizer era, with predictable results. The barbiturate story also reveals something important about how dangerous drugs can become normalized in medical practice. When barbiturates were first introduced, they were prescribed cautiously and for serious conditions. But over time, as doctors became more comfortable with the drugs, and as patient demand increased, prescribing patterns loosened. By the 1940s, barbiturates were being given out for conditions that probably didn't warrant such powerful medication. This gradual normalization of overprescribing would repeat itself with tranquilizers, and it's a pattern we've seen again with other drug classes, including opioids in more recent times. As we close this chapter on the barbiturate era, it's worth reflecting on what might have been different if the medical establishment had truly learned from this experience. What if doctors had been more cautious about the new tranquilizers, insisting on longer-term safety studies before prescribing them widely? What if pharmaceutical companies had been required to prove their new drugs were actually safer before marketing them as barbiturate replacements? What if American culture had questioned whether chemical solutions were really appropriate for everyday anxiety? These are all hypothetical questions, of course, and history unfolded as it did. But understanding the barbiturate era helps us see that the tranquilizer epidemic wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of how American medicine approached the treatment of anxiety and mental distress. The barbiturates had ruled American medicine for roughly 3 decades, and their reign was ending not because people no longer wanted chemical relief from their anxiety, but because the drugs themselves had proven too dangerous. The demand remained as strong as ever, stronger perhaps, given the pressures of post-war American life. What was needed was a new class of drugs that could meet this demand without causing the same problems. The pharmaceutical industry was ready to provide exactly that, and the American public was more than ready to embrace whatever new wonder drugs came along. The stage was set for the next act in this pharmaceutical drama, one that would see the rise of entirely new drug classes and the beginning of what we now recognize as the tranquilizer epidemic. The transition from barbiturates to tranquilizers represents one of those pivotal moments in medical history when everything seems to change while somehow staying exactly the same. The specific drugs would be different, the marketing would be more sophisticated, the scale of consumption would be even larger. But the fundamental dynamics, the aggressive pharmaceutical promotion, the liberal prescribing, the slow recognition of harm, the millions of people becoming dependent on drugs they'd been told were safe, all of these would repeat themselves with remarkable fidelity. Those who don't learn from pharmaceutical history, it seems, are doomed to repeat it, often with a fancier brand name and a more expensive copay. In the next chapter, we'll watch as Meprobamate, marketed as Milltown, bursts onto the scene and becomes the first true blockbuster tranquilizer. We'll see how this drug went from complete obscurity to cultural phenomenon in just a few years, how Hollywood celebrities turned it into a status symbol, and how millions of Americans became convinced that they couldn't face their daily lives without their daily dose. The barbiturate era had prepared the ground, created the demand, and established the patterns. The tranquilizer revolution was about to take all of that and amplify it to levels that even the most optimistic pharmaceutical executives couldn't have imagined. So settle in and get comfortable, because the story is just getting started, and it's about to get a whole lot more interesting. The irony of it all is that the tranquilizers were supposed to be the safer alternative, the solution to the barbiturate problem. And in some ways they were. The risk of fatal overdose was lower, the therapeutic window was wider. But in other ways, they would prove just as problematic as their predecessors, and in some cases even more so. The addiction that developed with tranquilizers was often more insidious than barbiturate dependency, partly because the drugs were marketed so effectively as safe that people didn't recognize the warning signs until they were already deeply dependent. The cultural normalization of tranquilizer use also exceeded anything seen in the barbiturate era, with pills becoming so mainstream that not taking them was almost seen as strange. Why would you struggle through your anxiety when there was a perfectly good pill available? But all of that comes later in our story. For now, we're standing at the threshold between two eras, the fading age of barbiturates and the dawn of the tranquilizer revolution. The year is 1950. Frank Berger has just noticed something interesting about meprobamate, and the pharmaceutical industry is hungry for the next big thing. Millions of Americans are taking barbiturates and increasingly worried about the risks, desperately hoping for a safer alternative. The perfect storm is gathering, and when it breaks, it will reshape American medicine and culture in ways that are still felt today. So let's take a breath here at the end of the barbiturate era. These drugs dominated American medicine for 3 decades, and their story is crucial for understanding what came next. They demonstrated the enormous appetite for anti-anxiety medication, the dangers of overprescribing, the addictive potential of CNS depressants, and the problems with pharmaceutical marketing that prioritizes sales over safety. Every one of these issues would resurface with the tranquilizers, often on a larger scale. The barbiturates were the opening act, the preliminary bout before the main event. They established the patterns, created the demand, and set the stage for what was to come. As we prepare to move into the tranquilizer era proper, keep in mind that we're not just looking at a story about drugs. We're examining a fundamental shift in how American society understood and treated anxiety. The idea that nervousness, worry, and everyday stress were medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention was radical at the turn of the 20th century. By 1950, it was accepted wisdom, and by 1960, it would be so normalized that questioning it seemed almost absurd. How did we get from a world where people coped with anxiety through willpower, prayer, fresh air, or maybe a stiff drink, to a world where millions of people couldn't imagine facing their day without their tranquilizer prescription? That's the story we're telling here, and the barbiturate era is chapter 1 of that transformation. The pharmaceutical companies had learned valuable lessons from the barbiturate experience, though perhaps not the lessons we might have hoped they'd learn. They'd learned that there was enormous money to be made in the anxiety medication market. They'd learned that doctors could be influenced through targeted marketing. They'd learned that patient demand could be created and amplified through the right messaging. And they'd learned that concerns about safety could be managed through clever communication and strategic positioning. All of these lessons would be applied with remarkable effectiveness in the marketing of tranquilizers, resulting in sales figures that dwarfed anything the barbiturate manufacturers had achieved. So we leave the barbiturate era behind, but we carry its legacy with us into the tranquilizer age. The patterns have been established, the market has been proven, and the demand is insatiable. What comes next will be a story of pharmaceutical innovation, marketing genius, cultural transformation, and ultimately the recognition that once again, the drugs we thought would save us have turned out to be far more complicated than we ever imagined. But that recognition would take years to develop, and in the meantime, millions of Americans would become the willing participants in the largest pharmaceutical experiment in history up to that time. The quiet epidemic of post-war America was about to find its voice, and that voice would be singing the praises of a little white pill called Milltown. But that, as they say, is a story for the next chapter. For now, rest assured that we've laid the groundwork, we understand the context, and we're ready to dive into the heart of the tranquilizer phenomenon. The barbiturate era has taught us what happens when dangerous drugs are marketed as safe solutions for everyday problems, and we're about to see those lessons ignored entirely as a new generation of wonder drugs takes center stage. The stakes are higher, the drugs are newer, and the consequences will be just as severe, if not more so. Welcome to the age of the tranquilizer, where peace of mind comes in a pill bottle and the whole country is about to get hooked. But before we fully transition to that next chapter, let's spend a bit more time examining the social landscape of the barbiturate era, because the cultural context is just as important as the pharmacological details. The 1930s and 1940s were decades of enormous upheaval in American society, and this turmoil created the perfect breeding ground for widespread pharmaceutical dependency. The Great Depression had shattered the economic security of millions of families. People who had worked their entire lives found themselves suddenly unemployed, their savings wiped out, their futures uncertain. The psychological toll of this economic catastrophe was immense, and it's no coincidence that barbiturate prescriptions increased dramatically during this period. When you can't pay your rent, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, when all the certainties of your life have been swept away, well, a pill that can make you forget your troubles for a few hours starts to look pretty appealing. The medical profession of the 1930s had limited tools for addressing the mental health consequences of economic disaster. Psychotherapy was still in its infancy and was largely available only to the wealthy. The concept of social determinants of health, the idea that poverty, unemployment, and social stress could cause genuine mental and physical illness, was barely acknowledged. Instead, doctors tended to view their patients' anxiety and depression as individual problems requiring individual solutions. If a working-class man came into a doctor's office complaining of sleeplessness and nervous tension, likely caused by the fact that he'd lost his job and couldn't feed his family, the doctor's response was typically to write a prescription for barbiturates. This was easier than addressing the underlying social causes of the distress, and frankly, the doctor didn't have the power to fix the economy anyway. So the prescription pad came out, the pills were dispensed, and another American citizen joined the growing ranks of barbiturate users. Women were particularly vulnerable to barbiturate dependency during this era, for reasons that reveal a great deal about the gender dynamics of mid-20th century America. The medical profession was overwhelmingly male, and these male doctors brought their cultural assumptions about women into their practices. Women who complained of nervousness, anxiety, or what we might now recognize as depression were often diagnosed with vague conditions like hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or neurasthenia. The treatment? Barbiturates, of course. The idea that a woman might be genuinely unhappy with her circumscribed social role, or that she might be experiencing legitimate stress from managing a household during economic hardship, was rarely considered. Instead, her distress was medicalized and treated with sedatives, effectively telling her that her feelings were a medical problem to be suppressed, rather than a rational response to difficult circumstances. This pattern of prescribing barbiturates to women would intensify during and after World War II. While men went off to fight, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on industrial jobs that had previously been reserved for men. They proved themselves more than capable, building planes and tanks and ships, running factories, keeping the American economy going while the men were overseas. But when the war ended and the men came home, women were expected to return to their domestic roles without complaint. The jobs they'd held were given back to returning veterans, and the cultural message was clear. Your brief foray into the working world is over, now get back to the kitchen. Many women struggled with this transition, having tasted independence and meaningful work outside the home. Their frustration and unhappiness were often met with barbiturate prescriptions. Feeling unfulfilled as a housewife? Take this pill. Missing the camaraderie and purpose of your wartime job? Here's something to help you adjust. The drugs were used to smooth over the cognitive dissonance of a society that had relied on women's capabilities during wartime but refused to acknowledge them during peacetime. The returning veterans themselves faced enormous challenges, and barbiturates played a significant role in their stories as well. Men who had experienced the horrors of combat came home with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term wouldn't be coined for decades. They had nightmares, flashbacks, difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The violence and trauma they'd witnessed didn't simply disappear when they took off their uniforms. Yet the cultural expectation was that they should come home, pick up where they left off, and get on with their lives. Talking about psychological struggles was seen as weakness, as unmanly. So these traumatized veterans sought help from their doctors, who prescribed the only medications they had available for anxiety and insomnia, barbiturates. The drugs allowed the veterans to sleep without nightmares, to quiet their racing thoughts, to push down the memories that haunted them. But they didn't heal the underlying trauma, they just masked it. and in the process created new problems of dependency and addiction. The family dynamics of this era are fascinating to consider from our modern perspective. Imagine a household in 1948. The father is a veteran taking barbiturates to cope with his undiagnosed PTSD. The mother is taking barbiturates because she's struggling with the transition from wartime independence back to full-time domesticity. Both are self-medicating their unhappiness with government-approved pharmaceuticals, and both probably think their struggles are unique to them, unaware that millions of other Americans are doing exactly the same thing. The kids in this household grow up watching their parents rely on pills to manage their emotions, normalizing pharmaceutical coping mechanisms for another generation. This wasn't some rare occurrence. It was happening in homes across the country, creating a cultural template for how Americans would deal with mental distress for decades to come. The late 1940s also saw important developments in how barbiturates were being used recreationally, which further complicated the picture for the medical establishment. Jazz musicians, beatnik poets, and various counterculture figures discovered that barbiturates could produce euphoric effects when taken in certain doses or combined with other substances. The drugs started appearing in contexts that had nothing to do with legitimate medical use, being passed around at parties and jazz clubs. This recreational use brought negative attention to the medications and began to erode their wholesome image. Suddenly, barbiturates weren't just medicines that respectable people took for their nerves. They were also drugs of abuse associated with bohemian lifestyles and criminal behavior. This duality would persist throughout the barbiturate era and would eventually contribute to the drug's declining reputation. The criminal justice system was also grappling with barbiturate-related issues by this point. Courts were seeing cases where crimes had been committed by people under the influence of barbiturates, and the legal questions were thorny. If someone took too many barbiturates and committed a crime while in a drug-induced state, were they responsible for their actions? What about the doctors who had prescribed the medications? Did they bear any liability? These questions didn't have clear answers, and the legal system struggled to develop appropriate frameworks for dealing with barbiturate-related offences. Meanwhile, black market trade in barbiturates was growing, with the drugs being diverted from legitimate medical channels and sold illegally. The same medications that respectable housewives were taking on prescription were being bought and sold on street corners, highlighting the complexity of these substances and their role in society. International comparisons are interesting here too. While the United States was experiencing massive barbiturate consumption, other countries were dealing with the same issues to varying degrees. The United Kingdom had its own barbiturate problem, as did many European countries. But the American situation was unique in its scale, driven by factors specific to US society, the aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, the fee-for-service medical system that incentivized prescribing, the cultural emphasis on quick fixes and personal improvement, the post-war boom that gave people disposable income to spend on medications. The American pharmaceutical industry was also the most sophisticated in the world in terms of marketing and distribution, which meant that new drugs could penetrate the market faster and more thoroughly than anywhere else. This combination of factors meant that whatever pharmaceutical trends emerged in America would be amplified to their maximum extent, for better or worse. By 1950, the barbiturate situation in America had reached a critical point. Estimates suggested that somewhere between 1 and 2 billion doses of barbiturates were being produced annually in the United States. That's enough for every man, woman, and child in the country to take multiple doses per year. Of course, the distribution wasn't even. Many people never touched the drugs, while others were taking them daily. But the sheer volume of production indicates just how embedded these medications had become in American healthcare. Pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing the drugs at enormous scale. Doctors were prescribing them freely, and patients were consuming them eagerly. The entire system, medical, commercial, and cultural, was oriented toward the mass consumption of these sedative medications. The medical journals of this period make for fascinating reading today. You can see doctors wrestling with the barbiturate problem in real time, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some physicians wrote passionate articles calling for stricter controls on prescribing, warning their colleagues about the dangers of dependency and overdose. Others pushed back, arguing that barbiturates were safe when used properly and that concerns were overblown. The debates were often heated, and they reveal the genuine uncertainty that existed within the medical profession about how to handle these drugs. What's striking from our contemporary perspective is how familiar these debates sound. The same arguments would be repeated for tranquilizers in the 1960s, for quaaludes in the 1970s, for benzodiazepines in the 1980s, and for opioids in the 2000s. The specific drugs change, but the pattern of debate, the initial enthusiasm, the gradual recognition of problems, the conflicts between those calling for caution and those defending the drugs, remains remarkably consistent. The pharmaceutical companies were well aware of the mounting concerns about barbiturates, and they responded in predictable fashion. Rather than pulling back on promotion or calling for more conservative prescribing guidelines, they accelerated their search for replacement drugs. The reasoning was simple. If barbiturates were becoming tainted in the public mind, the companies needed new products to maintain their market share. This wasn't about protecting public health, it was about protecting profit margins. And so research and development budgets swelled as chemists worked to find the next generation of anti-anxiety medications. The company that could bring a safer, more effective alternative to market would capture an enormous share of what was clearly a massive and growing market. Frank Berger, working at Carter Products, wasn't the only scientist pursuing this goal. Researchers at major pharmaceutical companies across the country were engaged in similar work, testing compounds and screening molecules for potential anxiolytic effects. The race was on, and the stakes were enormous. We should note that not all of these researchers were purely motivated by profit. Many were genuine scientists who hoped to develop medications that could help suffering patients without the dangerous side effects of barbiturates. Berger himself seems to have been genuinely interested in the science and in helping people, even as he recognized the commercial potential of his discoveries. But the broader context of pharmaceutical research meant that commercial considerations inevitably shaped what kinds of drugs were developed and how they were marketed. The cultural expectations around mental health were also evolving during this period, creating additional demand for anti-anxiety medications. The post-war boom had created unprecedented prosperity for many Americans, and with that prosperity came new pressures. People were expected to achieve the American dream, own a home, have a family, climb the corporate ladder, consume goods, project success. Those who felt anxious or depressed in the midst of all this prosperity often experienced additional guilt. Here they were, living in the greatest country in the world during an economic boom, and they were unhappy. Clearly something was wrong with them personally, not with society's expectations. This mindset made people eager to take medications that could help them function normally, to keep up with the relentless demands of post-war American life. The barbiturates had served this function, and their replacements would serve it even more effectively. Television was also emerging as a powerful cultural force during the late 1940s and early 1950s, and its influence on pharmaceutical consumption shouldn't be underestimated. American families gathered around their TV sets to watch programs that portrayed idealized versions of American life. Perfect homes, perfect families, mothers who were always cheerful, fathers who were always wise, problems that were resolved in 30 minutes. These representations set expectations for how people should feel and behave, and when real life didn't match up, people felt inadequate. A medication that could help you feel more like the calm, collected characters on television? Sign me up. The pharmaceutical industry hadn't yet started advertising directly to consumers through television. That would come later, but the cultural groundwork was being laid. Television was teaching Americans what normal should look like, and pharmaceutical companies would soon be offering pills to help people achieve that artificial normalcy. As we wrap up our exploration of the barbiturate era, let's take a moment to consider what had been accomplished by 1950. In just a few decades, the American medical establishment had succeeded in medicalizing ordinary human anxiety. What had previously been considered normal nervousness, the butterflies before a big event, the worry about an uncertain future, the stress of difficult life circumstances, had been transformed into medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical treatment. This was a profound shift with enormous implications. Once you've convinced people that their everyday emotions are symptoms of illness, you've created a permanent market for medications. People will always experience anxiety, will always face stress, will always have trouble sleeping sometimes. If these experiences are defined as medical problems, then there will always be demand for medical solutions. The pharmaceutical companies had also demonstrated their ability to scale production and distribution to meet this manufactured demand. The infrastructure for mass medication consumption was now in place, the factories producing billions of doses, the distribution networks reaching every pharmacy in the country, the marketing apparatus targeting every doctor's office. When the tranquilizers arrived, they wouldn't need to build this infrastructure from scratch. They could simply plug into the existing system and ride it to even greater heights of consumption. The ground had been thoroughly prepared for whatever came next. And the medical profession, despite some dissenting voices, had largely accepted its role as gatekeepers for this pharmaceutical consumption. Doctors had been trained to view prescribing as a primary tool for helping patients, and the pharmaceutical companies had been more than happy to reinforce this view through their marketing. The relationship between doctors and drug companies was well established and mutually beneficial. Companies provided doctors with information about new treatments, however biased, free samples to give to patients, and a sense of being on the cutting edge of medical progress. Doctors provided companies with a steady stream of prescriptions that translated directly into revenue. This symbiotic relationship would prove remarkably durable and would only intensify as the tranquilizers took center stage. Finally, the American public had been conditioned to view pharmaceutical solutions as appropriate responses to life's challenges. Taking pills for anxiety wasn't shameful or unusual. It was just what modern people did. This cultural acceptance was perhaps the most important legacy of the barbiturate era, because it meant that when the tranquilizers arrived, there would be no cultural resistance to overcome. People were already comfortable with the idea of chemical mood management. The tranquilizers just offered a better version of what they were already doing. So there you have it, the complete story of the barbiturate era, from the first synthesis of barbituric acid in 1864 to the dawn of the tranquilizer age in the early 1950s. It's a story of scientific innovation and commercial exploitation, of genuine medical progress and reckless overprescribing, of individual suffering and collective denial. The barbiturates had promised to liberate people from the burden of anxiety, and in some cases they had delivered on that promise. But they had also created new burdens, addiction, cognitive impairment, overdose risk, that in many ways were worse than the original problems. The medical establishment had learned that these drugs were dangerous, but they hadn't learned the deeper lesson about the dangers of mass medicating human emotion. That lesson would have to wait for another generation, another class of drugs, another wave of pharmaceutical enthusiasm followed by sobering recognition of harm. The tranquilizers were waiting in the wings, ready to take center stage. Frank Berger was refining his meprobamate compound, preparing for the clinical trials that would eventually lead to FDA approval. Carter Products was gearing up its marketing department, planning the campaign that would turn Milltown into a household name. Doctors across the country were eager for something new to offer their anxious patients, something that wouldn't carry the baggage of barbiturate addiction. And millions of Americans were ready and willing to embrace whatever new wonder drug the pharmaceutical industry had to offer. All the pieces were in place for the next act in this drama, and it was going to be spectacular in every sense of the word. Spectacularly successful commercially, spectacularly impactful culturally, and spectacularly problematic in ways that would take years to fully recognize. But that story begins in the next chapter. For now, we've completed our journey through the barbiturate era, and we have a solid foundation for understanding what came next. The patterns have been established, the precedents set, the market proven. The tranquilizer revolution didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew directly out of the barbiturate experience, both as a response to its problems and as a continuation of its underlying dynamics. Understanding one requires understanding the other, and now that we've thoroughly explored the barbiturate story, we're ready to dive into the tranquilizer phenomenon with full appreciation for its historical context. So take a moment to let all of this sink in. We've covered nearly 50 years of pharmaceutical history, from the first barbiturates in the early 1900s, through their peak popularity in the 1930s and 40s, to their troubled decline in the early 1950s. We've seen how these drugs went from medical innovations to mass-consumed commodities, how they created dependencies in millions of people, how they became entangled with gender dynamics and post-war social pressures, how they set the stage for everything that followed. The barbiturate era was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for the tranquilizer epidemic, and the show was about to go live. Get ready, because the main event is coming, and it's going to be quite a ride. The tranquilizers are about to arrive, and they're going to change everything, and nothing, all at once. Now, before we fully close the book on the barbiturate chapter, there are a few more threads we should follow, because they illuminate important aspects of what would come next. One of the most interesting phenomena of the late barbiturate era was the development of what we might call pill culture, a set of attitudes and behaviors around pharmaceutical consumption that went far beyond simple medical treatment. By the late 1940s, taking pills had become a kind of ritual for many Americans, a daily practice that structured their lives and gave them a sense of control over their emotions. People had their morning pills and their evening pills, their pills for anxiety and their pills for sleep. Medicine cabinets across the country were stocked with amber bottles, each containing its own promise of relief from whatever ailment, real or imagined, was troubling the household. This ritualization of pill-taking had profound psychological effects that extended beyond the pharmacological action of the drugs themselves. For many people, the simple act of swallowing their medication provided comfort, a reassurance that they were taking action against their distress. This placebo component of pharmaceutical treatment shouldn't be underestimated. Studies have consistently shown that people often feel better simply because they believe they're doing something to help themselves. The barbiturates certainly had real pharmacological effects, but they also benefited from this psychological boost that came from the ritual of treatment. When the tranquilizers arrived, they would inherit this cultural infrastructure of pill-taking, and it would amplify their effectiveness in ways that went beyond their chemistry. The geography of barbiturate consumption is also worth examining because it reveals interesting patterns about where and why these drugs took hold most firmly. Urban areas, particularly major metropolitan centres, showed higher rates of barbiturate prescribing than rural regions. This makes sense when you consider the factors we've been discussing. Cities had more doctors per capita, more sophisticated pharmaceutical distribution networks, and populations facing the particular stresses of urban life. The anonymity of city living, the fast pace, the competition, the crowding, all of these factors contributed to higher rates of anxiety and insomnia that doctors treated with barbiturates. Rural Americans certainly used these medications too, but the patterns were different. Rural doctors, often working in isolation without easy access to the latest medical information, tended to prescribe more conservatively. And rural communities, with their stronger social networks and different pace of life, may have had lower baseline rates of the anxiety that barbiturates were designed to treat. Regional differences also emerged. The Northeast and West Coast showed higher barbiturate consumption than the Midwest and South, patterns that would persist into the tranquilizer era and that reflected broader cultural differences between regions. Coastal areas, with their more cosmopolitan populations and faster adoption of national trends, embraced pharmaceutical solutions more readily than more traditional inland regions. These patterns remind us that the barbiturate epidemic, while national in scope, wasn't uniform in its distribution. The drugs penetrated different communities at different rates and to different degrees, shaped by local factors that included everything from physician density to cultural attitudes about medication. The economics of barbiturate production are fascinating to consider as well. By the late 1940s, a handful of major pharmaceutical companies controlled most of the barbiturate market, and the profit margins were substantial. The drugs were relatively inexpensive to manufacture, the chemical processes were well understood, and the raw materials were cheap. But they could be sold at significant markup, especially under brand names. Generic barbiturates were available, but brand name versions commanded premium prices, and the companies justified these prices through marketing that emphasized quality and consistency. Doctors, influenced by this marketing, often specified brand names in their prescriptions, directing profits to the major pharmaceutical companies rather than generic manufacturers. This economic structure meant that the companies had enormous financial incentives to maintain and expand the market for barbiturates, even as evidence of their dangers accumulated. Every prescription written represented revenue, and the companies used sophisticated marketing to ensure that prescriptions kept flowing. When concerns about safety threatened to reduce prescribing, the marketing departments worked overtime to reassure doctors that the drugs were safe when used properly. When competition emerged from generic manufacturers, the brand name companies emphasized their superior quality control and research expertise. The pharmaceutical industry had developed a toolkit for defending its markets that would prove remarkably durable across different drug classes and different eras. We should also consider the international dimension of the barbiturate story, because it provides important context for understanding America's unique situation. European countries also experienced significant barbiturate use during this period, but generally with better regulatory oversight and more conservative prescribing practices. The National Health Service in Britain, established in 1948, created a different dynamic than America's fee-for-service system. When the government is paying for medications, there's institutional pressure to control costs and avoid unnecessary prescribing. This doesn't mean Britain avoided barbiturate problems entirely. They certainly had their share of addiction and overdoses, but the scale was different than in America. The American system, with its emphasis on private practice medicine and pharmaceutical industry autonomy, created conditions for maximum drug consumption. Scandinavia took a particularly interesting approach to barbiturates, implementing prescription monitoring systems earlier than most other countries. Swedish authorities began tracking individual patients' barbiturate prescriptions in the 1940s, trying to identify and help those who were becoming dependent. This kind of surveillance was essentially non-existent in America, where each prescription was a private transaction between doctor and patient, with no systematic oversight. The idea of government tracking of prescription medications would have been viewed as an unacceptable intrusion in the American context, even though such tracking might have helped identify problematic patterns much earlier. This libertarian approach to pharmaceutical regulation would persist through the Tranquilizer era and beyond, contributing to the scale of drug problems in America. Japan's experience with barbiturates also offers interesting contrasts. The drugs were available there, but cultural attitudes toward medication differed from American norms. Japanese culture traditionally emphasized stoicism and self-control, and there was significant stigma attached to taking medications for mental health conditions. This cultural resistance slowed the adoption of barbiturates in Japan, even as the country rapidly modernized in other ways. The lesson here is that pharmaceutical epidemics aren't purely determined by drug availability. Cultural factors play enormous roles in shaping patterns of consumption. America's cultural openness to pharmaceutical solutions, combined with its aggressive pharmaceutical industry and loosely regulated medical system, created a perfect storm for mass medication consumption. The media coverage of barbiturates evolved significantly throughout the 1940s. Early coverage was generally positive, emphasizing the drug's ability to help people cope with modern stresses. Magazine articles portrayed barbiturate users sympathetically, and there was little sense that taking these medications was problematic. But by the late 1940s and early 1950s, media coverage began shifting as stories of addiction, overdose, and death accumulated. Newspapers covered inquest verdicts that attributed deaths to barbiturate overdose, often running these stories with headlines that emphasized the tragic circumstances. Magazine pieces began questioning whether Americans had become too dependent on these medications, exploring the darker side of pharmaceutical mood management. This shift in media framing is important because it helped create the conditions for tranquilizers to be welcomed as safer alternatives. If the media had remained uncritically positive about barbiturates, there might have been less appetite for new drugs. But as stories of barbiturate dangers accumulated in the public consciousness, people became primed to embrace whatever came next. The tranquilizer manufacturers would capitalize on this by positioning their products explicitly as safer alternatives to barbiturates, using the negative press coverage of the older drugs to make their new products look better by comparison. It was a classic marketing move: make the competition look bad, then present yourself as the solution. The psychiatric profession deserves special attention in our story of the barbiturate era, because psychiatrists played a complex role in how these drugs were used and understood. In the 1940s and early 1950s, American psychiatry was still dominated by psychoanalytic thinking, with its emphasis on unconscious conflicts and talk therapy. Many psychiatrists viewed medications with suspicion, seeing them as superficial treatments that didn't address underlying psychological issues. From this perspective, giving someone barbiturates for anxiety was like putting a bandage on a wound without cleaning it first. You might cover up the problem temporarily, but you weren't really solving anything. This psychiatric skepticism meant that most barbiturate prescribing wasn't being done by mental health specialists. It was being done by general practitioners, family doctors who had no specialized training in mental health, but who were seeing patients with anxiety and insomnia every day in their offices. These doctors needed something to offer their nervous patients, and barbiturates fit the bill. The drugs were easy to prescribe, they worked quickly, and patients were satisfied. The general practitioners didn't have time to explore the psychological roots of their patients' anxiety. They had dozens of other patients waiting to be seen. So they wrote prescriptions, the patients got their pills, and everyone was happy, at least in the short term. This division of labor, psychiatrists focusing on talk therapy, while general practitioners handled medication prescribing, would persist into the tranquilizer era and would have important consequences. When the tranquilizers arrived, they would be marketed primarily to general practitioners rather than psychiatrists, and these doctors would become the primary conduits for getting the drugs into patients' hands. The general practitioners had neither the time nor the training to carefully evaluate each patient's mental health needs, to consider whether medication was really the best approach, to monitor for signs of dependency or adverse effects. They were seeing patients for 15-minute appointments, and they needed quick solutions. The tranquilizers, like the barbiturates before them, provided those quick solutions, and the prescriptions flowed freely. The legal landscape around barbiturates was also evolving during the late 1940s and early 1950s, as authorities struggled to control the drug's misuse. The Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had given the FDA authority to regulate drug safety, but the agency's powers were limited and its resources stretched thin. Barbiturates required prescriptions, but enforcement was lax and the drugs were relatively easy to obtain. Some people maintained prescriptions from multiple doctors, what we now call doctor shopping, accumulating large supplies of the drugs. Others obtained barbiturates through illegal channels, from drug dealers who had diverted them from legitimate sources. The black market for barbiturates was substantial by the late 1940s, and it intersected with criminal underworlds in ways that troubled law enforcement. Various states passed laws attempting to tighten control over barbiturates, requiring special prescription forms or limiting the quantity that could be prescribed at once. But these measures were patchwork and inconsistent, varying from state to state and often easy to circumvent. The federal government considered stronger national controls on barbiturates during this period, but pharmaceutical industry lobbyists successfully argued against heavy-handed regulation, warning that it would interfere with legitimate medical use. This lobbying pattern, industry groups opposing regulatory restrictions while emphasizing the importance of physician autonomy, would repeat itself throughout subsequent pharmaceutical crises. The companies had learned that wrapping their commercial interests in the language of medical freedom was an effective strategy for avoiding regulation. The insurance industry's evolving role in American healthcare also shaped barbiturate patterns in ways that deserve mention. Health insurance was becoming more common in post-war America, with employer-provided coverage expanding rapidly. When insurance began covering prescription medications, it removed one of the barriers to pharmaceutical consumption: cost. Patients who might have thought twice about paying out of pocket for monthly prescriptions were more willing to take medications when insurance covered the expense. This dynamic would accelerate dramatically in the tranquilizer era, when the drugs became so popular that insurance companies started questioning whether they should be covering them at all. But in the barbiturate period, insurance coverage was still relatively new and the implications weren't fully understood. The pharmaceutical research enterprise was transforming during this period as well, becoming more sophisticated and systematic. Companies were investing heavily in research and development, hiring chemists and pharmacologists to screen compounds and develop new products. The discovery process was still largely serendipitous. Scientists would synthesize compounds and test them on animals, hoping to stumble upon something useful. There wasn't yet the detailed understanding of neuropharmacology that would come later, so researchers were working somewhat in the dark. But the investment was paying off, and the pipeline of new drugs was growing. The company that could identify a successful barbiturate alternative would reap enormous rewards, and this incentive drove intense research activity across the industry. Frank Berger's work with meprobamate at Carter Products fit into this broader context of pharmaceutical research. He was one of many scientists searching for new compounds with anti-anxiety properties, though his approach was somewhat unconventional. His focus on muscle relaxation as a pathway to anxiety relief was unique, and it would prove prophetic. When he finally synthesized meprobamate and observed its calming effects on laboratory animals, he recognized that he might have found something genuinely new. A compound that could reduce anxiety without the heavy sedation characteristic of barbiturates. The difference was subtle but significant, and it would become the foundation for an entirely new category of medications. As we finally prepare to leave the barbiturate era behind, let's acknowledge the human cost of these decades of chemical experimentation. Millions of people suffered from barbiturate addiction, their lives constrained and complicated by their dependency on these drugs. Thousands died from overdoses, some accidental, some intentional, some somewhere in between. Families were disrupted by the behavioral changes that chronic barbiturate use could cause. The drowsiness, the irritability, the cognitive impairment. Children grew up watching parents struggle with pills, internalizing lessons about chemical coping that they would carry into their own adult lives. The toll was enormous and largely uncounted, because no one was systematically tracking the consequences of mass barbiturate consumption. Yet these same decades also saw genuine medical progress. Barbiturates did help some people, providing relief from severe insomnia and anxiety that had genuinely impaired their functioning. The drugs represented a step forward from earlier treatments like bromides and chloral hydrate, which had their own serious problems, and the experience with barbiturates, painful as it was, generated knowledge that would inform future approaches to psychiatric medication. The medical profession learned, slowly and incompletely, about the risks of chemical dependency and the importance of monitoring long-term drug use. These lessons weren't learned quickly enough to prevent the tranquilizer epidemic, but they were being learned nonetheless, and they would eventually contribute to more cautious approaches to psychotropic prescribing. The barbiturate era ended not with a sudden stop but with a gradual fade, as the new tranquilizers took over the market and pushed the older drugs aside. Barbiturates didn't disappear entirely. They continued to be used for specific purposes like anesthesia and seizure control. But their role as primary anti-anxiety medications ended with the rise of meprobamate and its successors. By the late 1950s, barbiturate prescriptions for anxiety were declining sharply, replaced by the new wonder drugs that promised all the benefits with none of the risks. The promises would prove hollow, of course, but that realization lay in the future. For now, the barbiturate chapter was closing and the tranquilizer chapter was opening, and America was once again ready to embrace pharmaceutical salvation. So there we have it, the complete story of America's barbiturate era, told in all its complicated glory. We've seen how these drugs emerged from German laboratories at the turn of the century and spread throughout American medicine over the following decades. We've watched them go from carefully controlled medications to freely prescribed commodities, from medical innovations to public health problems. We've explored the social, cultural, and economic factors that drove their widespread adoption, and we've examined the consequences of that adoption for individuals and society. We've set the stage, established the patterns, and prepared ourselves for what comes next. The tranquilizers are waiting in the wings, ready for their moment in the spotlight. They're going to make the barbiturate era look like a preliminary warm-up, taking everything we've discussed and amplifying it to levels that will astound even those who lived through the barbiturate years. The numbers will be bigger, the marketing more sophisticated, the cultural penetration deeper, but the fundamental dynamics will remain the same: aggressive pharmaceutical promotion, liberal prescribing, mass consumption, slow recognition of harm. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and we're about to hear a very familiar tune played in a new key. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for the next chapter. We're about to meet Milltown, the little white pill that will become the first pharmaceutical blockbuster in history. We're about to see how Hollywood celebrities turned anxiety medication into a status symbol, how millions of Americans became convinced they couldn't function without their daily dose, how a whole nation got tranquilized. The barbiturate era has taught us what to watch for, and now we're ready to see those patterns play out on an even grander scale. The quiet epidemic is about to get a whole lot louder, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it. The year was 1950, and Frank Berger was having a rather peculiar day in his laboratory at Carter Products in New Jersey. He'd been working on muscle relaxants, trying to develop better compounds for treating patients with muscle spasms and tension. It wasn't exactly glamorous work. No one was going to write headlines about muscle relaxants, but it was solid pharmaceutical research, the kind of methodical chemical tinkering that occasionally produced useful medications. Berger, a Czech-born scientist who had fled Europe during the war, was methodical by nature, carefully documenting his observations and paying attention to details that other researchers might overlook. This attention to detail was about to change pharmaceutical history, though Berger had no way of knowing that as he administered yet another compound to his laboratory mice. The compound in question was meprobamate, a chemical that Berger had synthesized as part of his muscle relaxant research. He'd been testing various derivatives of mefenecin, a compound known to have muscle relaxant properties but with an inconveniently short duration of action. Meprobamate was his latest attempt to create something that would last longer in the body, providing sustained muscle relaxation rather than the brief effects of mefenecin. He injected the compound into his test mice and settled in to observe the results, expecting to see the typical muscle relaxation effects he'd observed with similar compounds. What he saw instead was something quite different and quite remarkable. The mice became calm, not sleepy, not sedated in the way that barbiturates would sedate them, but genuinely calm. They remained alert and active, moving around their cages, eating, drinking, behaving like normal mice in most respects. But they were noticeably less reactive to stressful stimuli. When Berger introduced elements that would normally cause the mice to become agitated or fearful, they responded with what could only be described as equanimity. They noticed the stressors, they responded appropriately but without the usual anxiety and fear reactions. It was as if someone had turned down the volume on their nervous systems without switching off the power entirely. Berger recognized immediately that he was looking at something potentially significant. This wasn't just muscle relaxation, this was something else entirely. The compound seemed to be affecting the animal's emotional responses, reducing anxiety without causing the heavy sedation that characterized barbiturates. If this effect translated to humans, he might have discovered exactly what the medical world was desperately seeking: a drug that could calm anxious patients without putting them to sleep or impairing their function. The implications were enormous, and Berger began documenting his observations with renewed intensity. Of course, what works in mice doesn't always work in humans, and Berger knew he had a long road ahead before he could make any grand claims about his compound. But he was encouraged enough to begin pushing for human trials, trying to convince his colleagues and supervisors at Carter Products that meprobamate deserved serious investigation. This wasn't an easy sell. Carter Products was a small pharmaceutical company, best known for products like Carter's Little Liver Pills, which were, let's be charitable here, not exactly cutting-edge pharmaceutical innovations. The idea of pivoting to psychopharmaceutical research seemed ambitious, perhaps overly so. Some of Berger's colleagues were skeptical that a small company like Carter could successfully bring a major new psychiatric medication to market, competing against the pharmaceutical giants that dominated the industry. But Berger was persistent and his enthusiasm was infectious. He arranged demonstrations for company executives, showing them his remarkably calm mice and explaining the potential market for a safe anti-anxiety medication. He pointed to the problems with barbiturates, the millions of Americans taking these dangerous drugs, the desperate need for safer alternatives. The market was there, he argued, massive and underserved. The company that could provide a genuinely better option would reap enormous rewards. Eventually his arguments won the day, and Carter Products agreed to fund further research on meprobamate. The executives probably had no idea what they were getting into, but to their credit, they gave Berger the resources he needed to pursue his discovery. The next few years were spent conducting animal studies, refining the compound, and preparing for human trials. Berger worked methodically, documenting effects, dosages, safety profiles, all the information that would be needed to eventually seek FDA approval. The animal data was encouraging. Meprobamate consistently produced its calming effects across different species without the dangerous side effects associated with barbiturates. The therapeutic window appeared wider than barbiturates, meaning there was a larger gap between an effective dose and a harmful one. This was crucial for safety, as one of the major problems with barbiturates was how easy it was to accidentally overdose. Human trials began in the early 1950s, and the results exceeded expectations. Patients with anxiety disorders reported significant relief from their symptoms without the heavy sedation they experienced with barbiturates. They felt calmer, more able to cope with daily stresses, more functional in their lives. The side effects were relatively mild compared to barbiturates, some drowsiness, occasional dizziness, but nothing like the cognitive impairment and coordination problems that barbiturates caused. Patients could take meprobamate and still drive, still work, still think clearly. This was revolutionary. For the first time, there seemed to be a medication that could address anxiety without turning patients into zombies. The clinical trials also revealed something interesting about the subjective experience of taking meprobamate. Patients didn't just report feeling less anxious. They reported feeling more like themselves, more capable of handling their emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This was different from the barbiturate experience, where patients often felt dulled, disconnected, not quite present in their own lives. Meprobamate seemed to take the edge off anxiety while leaving the essential person intact. Whether this was genuinely a pharmacological difference or partly a placebo effect amplified by hopeful expectations, the reports were consistent enough to be significant. Patients liked how the drug made them feel, and that patient satisfaction would prove enormously important for the medication's commercial success. Carter Products now faced a challenge: how to bring this promising compound to market. They needed to navigate the FDA approval process, develop manufacturing capacity, create a marketing strategy, and somehow convince doctors to prescribe this new medication from a relatively unknown company. The executives decided that they needed a more pharmaceutical-sounding brand name than Carter's meprobamate, or something similarly uninspiring. After much deliberation, they settled on Milltown, named after the small New Jersey town of Milltown, near where the company was located. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the naming choice. They could have chosen something clinical and medical sounding, something ending in or ol that would fit in with other pharmaceutical names. Instead, they chose a name that sounded almost like a place you might visit, a peaceful destination where you could escape your worries. Milltown! It even sounds calming just saying it. The FDA approved meprobamate in 1955, and Carter Products began marketing Milltown to physicians. Their initial sales expectations were modest. They were a small company after all, and breaking into the established pharmaceutical market was notoriously difficult. They allocated a marketing budget that reflected these modest expectations, planning for steady, gradual growth as word spread about this new anxiety medication. What actually happened made those projections look almost comically conservative. The first month of Milltown sales brought in around $7,500, which sounds modest until you realize what came next. Word spread through the medical community with remarkable speed. Doctors who tried prescribing Milltown to their anxious patients were seeing excellent results. Patients reporting relief without the problems associated with barbiturates. These doctors told their colleagues, who tried the medication with their own patients and had similar experiences. Medical journals published positive reports, and physicians' enthusiasm grew. Within a year, sales had multiplied many times over. By 1957, just 2 years after launch, Americans were consuming over 1 billion Milltown tablets annually. 1 billion tablets. That's not a typo. In a country of roughly 170 million people, that works out to about 6 tablets per person per year, including children and everyone who never took the drug. Among actual users, the consumption rates were staggeringly high. The sales figures were unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. No medication had ever achieved this kind of market penetration this quickly. Milltown became the first pharmaceutical blockbuster, creating a template that drug companies would try to replicate for decades to come. Carter Products, that modest little company known for liver pills, suddenly found itself at the center of a pharmaceutical gold rush. Their stock price skyrocketed, making the executives who had taken a chance on Berger's research very wealthy indeed. The small manufacturing facility they'd set up couldn't keep pace with demand, and they had to rapidly expand production capacity. At various points in 1956 and 1957, Milltown was actually in short supply, with pharmacies running out of the medication and patients desperately seeking refills. Imagine that, a pharmaceutical company unable to produce enough product to meet demand. It was an enviable problem, but a problem nonetheless. The rapid adoption of Milltown was driven by several converging factors. First, there was genuine medical need. The barbiturate problems we discussed in the previous chapter had created real demand for safer alternatives, and Milltown seemed to fit the bill. Doctors were eager to have something better to offer their anxious patients, and Milltown gave them that option. Second, the medication genuinely worked. Patients reported significant improvement in their anxiety symptoms, and word of mouth spread both among doctors and among patients themselves. People told their friends about this wonderful new medication that had transformed their lives, and those friends went to their own doctors asking for prescriptions. Third, the marketing, while initially modest, hit exactly the right notes, emphasizing safety and effectiveness while positioning the drug as a modern solution for modern anxieties. But there was a fourth factor that transformed Milltown from a successful medication into a cultural phenomenon, and that factor was Hollywood. The entertainment industry's embrace of Milltown would amplify its success beyond anything the pharmaceutical marketers could have orchestrated themselves, turning a prescription medication into a status symbol and launching the tranquilizer into the stratosphere of American consciousness. The story of how Hollywood discovered Milltown is itself fascinating, revealing the interconnected nature of post-war American society. Several pathways brought the drug to the attention of the entertainment industry. Some actors and directors learned about Milltown through their personal physicians, many of whom were prescribing the new medication to their anxious patients. The entertainment industry attracted people with anxiety issues. The constant pressure to perform, the insecurity of the business, the public scrutiny, all of these factors made show business people prime candidates for anti-anxiety medication. When these individuals started taking Milltown and experiencing its calming effects, they naturally talked about it with their colleagues. Word spread through Hollywood with the same speed it had spread through the medical community, perhaps even faster given the entertainment industry's love of trends and novelties. The comedian Milton Berle was reportedly one of the early celebrity adopters of Milltown, and he made jokes about the medication in his routines, bringing it to the attention of his massive television audience. Berle would quip that he was so relaxed from taking Milltown that he'd changed his name to Milltown Berle. It was a corny joke, the kind of thing that would barely register today. But in the context of 1950s entertainment, it was significant. Here was a major celebrity openly talking about taking a psychiatric medication, treating it not as something shameful but as something amusing and relatable. The joke normalized Milltown use in a way that no pharmaceutical advertisement could have achieved. Other celebrities followed suit, talking openly about their Miltown use in interviews and casual conversation. This was remarkable for the era. Mental health issues were heavily stigmatized in the 1950s, and admitting to anxiety or nervous troubles was typically seen as a sign of weakness. But the celebrity endorsements of Miltown reframed the narrative. These weren't weak people unable to cope with life. These were successful, glamorous individuals who had found a modern solution to modern pressures. If movie stars were taking Miltown, then surely it was acceptable for ordinary people to take it too. The celebrities provided a kind of permission structure, making it socially acceptable to seek pharmaceutical help for anxiety. The Hollywood party scene became a showcase for Miltown's popularity. At cocktail parties and industry gatherings, the drug became a topic of conversation and even a social accessory. Hostesses would put out bowls of Miltown tablets alongside the nuts and candies, offering guests a pill along with their martini. This probably wasn't medically advisable. Mixing tranquilizers with alcohol is generally not recommended. But medical caution wasn't exactly the defining characteristic of 1950s party culture. The gesture itself was significant. Miltown had become so normalized, so socially acceptable, that offering it to guests was considered a form of hospitality. "Can I get you a drink?" And perhaps some Miltown to take the edge off. It was almost quaint in its casualness, and completely revolutionary in its implications. The entertainment media picked up on this trend and amplified it through magazine articles and gossip columns. Feature stories discussed which celebrities were taking Miltown, treating the information with the same breathless interest usually reserved for fashion choices or romantic entanglements. What's in your medicine cabinet became a legitimate topic for celebrity profiles, and Miltown was frequently mentioned. This media coverage created a feedback loop. As more people read about celebrity Miltown use, more people became interested in the drug, which created more stories, which generated more interest. The pharmaceutical companies couldn't have designed a better marketing campaign if they'd tried. The language used to discuss Miltown in the popular press was revealing. Articles referred to the medication as happy pills or peace of mind pills, framing it as a lifestyle product rather than a serious medication for mental health conditions. This linguistic shift was important because it lowered the barrier to use. People who might have been reluctant to take a psychiatric medication were much more comfortable taking peace of mind pills. The rebranding made Miltown seem less clinical, less serious, more aligned with other consumer products that promised to improve quality of life. It was pharmaceutical marketing genius, even though much of it happened organically through media coverage rather than planned advertising campaigns. Carter Products, watching their sales explode beyond all projections, eventually did develop more sophisticated marketing campaigns. They took out advertisements in medical journals that emphasized Miltown's safety profile compared to barbiturates, targeting the doctors who would be writing prescriptions. These ads featured images of calm, contented patients and emphasized that Miltown allowed people to manage anxiety while maintaining their normal functioning. The messaging was carefully crafted to appeal to physicians' desire to help their patients without causing harm. Doctors who had spent years worrying about barbiturate addiction and overdose found these messages compelling. But the company also engaged in something more novel for the time, marketing that reached beyond physicians to the general public. While direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising as we know it today didn't exist in the 1950s, there were ways to influence public perception. Carter Products sponsored educational programs about anxiety and stress management, programs that conveniently mentioned that effective treatments were available. They cultivated relationships with journalists who wrote health features, providing information and statistics that found their way into articles. They capitalized on the celebrity endorsements, making sure that the media had plenty of positive stories to report. It was a comprehensive approach to building brand awareness that went far beyond traditional medical marketing. The success of Miltown attracted competition naturally. Other pharmaceutical companies saw what Carter Products had achieved and rushed to develop their own tranquilizers. Wyeth Pharmaceuticals licensed the right to produce meprobamate and marketed it under the brand name Equinil, providing competition in the marketplace. The competition actually helped expand the overall market for tranquilizers, as multiple companies marketing similar products increased public awareness and medical acceptance. Wyeth had stronger marketing resources than Carter Products, and was able to reach physicians that Carter hadn't penetrated. The result was that meprobamate, under its various brand names, became even more widely prescribed than it would have been with just one company promoting it. By the late 1950s, the cultural penetration of Miltown was remarkable. References to the drug appeared in movies, television shows, novels, and popular music. Songwriters wrote lyrics mentioning tranquilizers, treating them as just another aspect of modern life. Television sitcoms made jokes about characters needing their Miltown to cope with domestic situations. The drug had transcended its status as a medication and become a cultural reference point, a shorthand for modern anxieties and their chemical solutions. When people joked about needing a Miltown, everyone understood what they meant. The brand name had become almost generic, the way we might say Kleenex for tissue or Band-Aid for adhesive bandages. The gender dynamics of Miltown use are particularly interesting and reveal much about 1950s American society. While both men and women took the medication, marketing and cultural representation often focused on women, particularly middle-class housewives. This targeting reflected both genuine prescribing patterns. Women were more likely to seek help for anxiety and more likely to receive prescriptions, and cultural assumptions about who needed chemical help managing their emotions. The image of the tranquilized housewife, calm and serene as she managed her domestic duties, became a cultural trope. This image was simultaneously empowering and troubling. On one hand, it acknowledged that women experienced stress and deserved relief. On the other hand, it suggested that the appropriate response to women's distress was chemical sedation, rather than addressing the underlying causes of that distress. The pharmaceutical companies actively marketed to this demographic, creating advertisements that showed harried housewives finding peace through Miltown. One typical ad might show a woman surrounded by demanding children and household chaos, looking overwhelmed. The next image would show the same woman, now calm and smiling, presumably after taking her medication. The message was clear. Miltown could help you cope with the stresses of domestic life, allowing you to be the perfect mother and wife that society expected. Never mind that those expectations might be unreasonable, or that the stress might indicate real problems that deserved real solutions. The pill would smooth it all over. This gendered marketing had long-term consequences for how society understood women's mental health. The tranquilized housewife became such a common image that women's legitimate distress was often dismissed as something requiring medication rather than systemic change. Betty Friedan would later write about the problem that has no name, describing the malaise that affected so many suburban housewives in the 1950s and 60s. Part of that problem was that women's unhappiness was being medicated away rather than understood and addressed. The tranquilizers provided a Band-Aid solution that allowed everyone to ignore the underlying issues. Men's use of Miltown was framed differently in the cultural conversation. For men, the drug was presented as a tool for managing workplace stress, for handling the pressures of the corporate world without cracking under the strain. The organization man, that iconic figure of 1950s corporate America, was expected to be calm, controlled, and capable under pressure. Miltown could help him maintain that facade, smoothing over the anxiety that came with competitive business environments and providing the steady nerves needed for success. Advertisements targeting men emphasized performance and function, showing executives making important decisions with calm confidence, their Miltown having taken the edge off their natural nervousness. The celebrity endorsement phenomenon reached its peak in the mid to late 1950s, with Miltown achieving a kind of glamour that no pharmaceutical product had ever enjoyed before. When actresses mentioned their Miltown use in interviews, they weren't being confessional or apologetic. They were being matter-of-fact, even proud. Taking Miltown was presented as sophisticated, as a mark of someone who was modern enough to use available tools for self-improvement. This reframing was remarkable. A few decades earlier, admitting to taking medication for nerves would have been socially damaging. Now it was almost fashionable. The cocktail party phenomenon deserves special attention, because it illustrates just how normalized Miltown had become in certain social circles. These weren't just occasional occurrences. There are multiple documented accounts of tranquilizers being served at parties throughout the late 1950s. Guests would arrive, receive their drinks, and be offered pills from decorative containers. The juxtaposition of the formal party setting with the casual distribution of psychiatric medication is striking to modern sensibilities. We're accustomed to thinking of prescription medications as serious controlled substances that should be used only under medical supervision. The idea of serving them like party favors seems reckless, even dangerous. But in the context of the time, it made a certain kind of sense. If Miltown was safe enough for millions of Americans to take daily, why not share it at a party? If it could help people relax and enjoy themselves, wasn't that just good hospitality? The medical profession's response to this cultural phenomenon was mixed. Many doctors were thrilled to have a safer alternative to barbiturates and prescribed Miltown enthusiastically. They saw the drug as a genuine advance, a tool that could help their anxious patients without the risks that had made barbiturate prescribing so fraught. These physicians embraced Milltown and contributed to its rapid adoption by sharing their positive experiences with colleagues and writing favorable reports in medical journals. Patient demand also played a role. When patients came in specifically asking for Milltown, having heard about it from friends or read about it in magazines, doctors were often happy to comply. The alternative was refusing the request and potentially losing the patient to a more accommodating physician. However, some doctors were concerned about the speed of Milltown's adoption and the lack of long-term safety data. These medications hadn't been around long enough to know what effects they might have after years of use. Was Milltown really non-addictive, as the marketing claimed, or would dependency issues emerge over time? What about long-term effects on cognition, mood, or physical health? These questions didn't have answers because the drug simply hadn't been available long enough to generate the data. Some cautious physicians urged their colleagues to prescribe more conservatively, to wait for more evidence before putting millions of patients on this new medication. But these voices were largely drowned out by the enthusiasm of the medical mainstream and the overwhelming patient demand. The addiction question would eventually prove significant, though it took several years for the problems to become apparent. Meprobamate, it turned out, was indeed capable of causing physical dependence, and withdrawal from the drug could be serious. Patients who had been taking Milltown regularly for extended periods found that they couldn't simply stop without experiencing withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and in severe cases seizures. The drug that had been marketed as a safe alternative to addictive barbiturates was itself addictive, just in different ways. This revelation would come later, however, and in the mid-1950s, the predominant narrative was one of safety and efficacy. The scale of Milltown consumption by 1957 is worth emphasizing again because the numbers are so staggering. 1 in 20 Americans was taking Milltown or its equivalents. That's 5% of the entire population, or roughly 8 to 9 million people. In some demographics, the rates were even higher. Among middle-class suburban women, usage rates approached 15 or 20% by some estimates. These weren't marginal numbers. This was a significant portion of the American population taking psychiatric medication on a regular basis. Nothing like this had ever happened before in human history. No medication, no substance of any kind had ever achieved this level of penetration into a society's daily life this quickly. The economic impact was substantial as well. Milltown and related tranquilizers represented a massive new market segment in the pharmaceutical industry, generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. This success reshaped the pharmaceutical business model, demonstrating that the real money was in drugs for chronic conditions that large numbers of people would take indefinitely, rather than acute medications taken briefly. Anxiety, unlike an infection or a broken bone, doesn't necessarily go away. If you could convince people they needed medication for their ongoing anxiety, you had customers for life. This business model would prove incredibly influential for the pharmaceutical industry's future direction. Carter Products found itself transformed by Milltown's success. The company that had been a modest player in the pharmaceutical market was now a major force, with stock analysts and investors paying close attention to their every move. They invested heavily in research, hoping to discover more blockbuster medications. They expanded their sales force, building the infrastructure to compete with larger pharmaceutical companies. The success was almost too much, too fast, and the company struggled to manage its rapid growth. There were growing pains, challenges with scaling production, difficulties with maintaining quality control. But these were good problems to have, problems that came from success rather than failure. The cultural impact extended beyond mere consumption statistics. Milltown changed how Americans thought about mental health, emotion, and pharmaceutical intervention. Before Milltown, taking medication for nerves was seen as a mark of weakness or mental illness. After Milltown, it was normalized, even fashionable. This was a profound shift in cultural attitudes, one that would have lasting implications for American society. We became a nation that expected pharmaceutical solutions for emotional distress, that viewed anxiety as a medical condition requiring medical treatment, that trusted pills to manage feelings. Whether this was progress or a problematic medicalization of normal human experience is still debated today, but there's no question that Milltown represented a turning point in that evolution. The late 1950s saw Milltown at the peak of its cultural dominance, though storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Reports of addiction and withdrawal were beginning to accumulate, and some physicians were starting to question whether they'd been too enthusiastic in their prescribing. Media coverage, which had been overwhelmingly positive, began to include occasional critical pieces questioning America's rush to tranquilize itself. But these concerns were still minority views, and the overwhelming cultural narrative remained positive. Miltown was the wonder drug that had brought peace of mind to millions, the modern solution to modern problems, the pill that kept America calm and functional. What nobody knew at the time was that Miltown's reign would be relatively short-lived. Even as it dominated the market, researchers at other pharmaceutical companies were working on new compounds that would make meprobamate obsolete. The benzodiazepines were coming, and they would make Miltown look like a minor preliminary to the main event. But that's a story for future chapters. For now, we're in the late 1950s and Miltown is king. The tranquilizer revolution has arrived, America has embraced it wholeheartedly, and the pharmaceutical industry has learned valuable lessons about creating and marketing blockbuster drugs. Hollywood has played its part, transforming a medication into a cultural phenomenon and demonstrating the power of celebrity endorsement decades before that would become a standard marketing technique. As we prepare to move forward in our story, let's take a moment to appreciate what had been accomplished in just a few years. A small pharmaceutical company, betting on the insight of a persistent scientist, had launched a medication that would become a cultural touchstone. Millions of Americans had been convinced that their anxiety was a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical treatment. The entertainment industry had normalized psychiatric medication use in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, and the pharmaceutical industry had discovered a business model that would generate enormous profits for decades to come. The quiet epidemic of post-war America had found its first major enabler, and the nation was only too happy to swallow it. The story of Miltown and Hollywood isn't just a tale of pharmaceutical success. It's a story about American culture, about our relationship with emotion and chemistry, about the power of celebrity and marketing, about how quickly society can embrace new solutions to old problems. The tranquilizer revolution didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific cultural moment, driven by specific social forces, amplified by specific media dynamics. Understanding those forces helps us understand not just this historical period, but our ongoing complicated relationship with psychiatric medication. We're still dealing with the legacy of what started in those years, still grappling with questions about when medication is appropriate, still navigating the tension between helping people suffer less and medicating away legitimate distress. But there's more to come in our story. Miltown's success inspired intense competition, and the next generation of tranquilizers was already in development. The benzodiazepines would soon arrive, bringing with them even greater potency, even wider adoption, and eventually even more serious problems with dependency and withdrawal. The pharmaceutical companies had learned from Miltown's success and were ready to apply those lessons at even larger scale. The doctors were primed to prescribe, the patients were ready to consume, and the stage was set for the next act in America's tranquilizer drama. So stay with me as we continue this journey through the quiet epidemic. We've seen the barbiturate era and its problems, we've witnessed the rise of Miltown and its cultural triumph, and next we'll explore the statistics that reveal just how widespread tranquilizer use became. The numbers will astound you, and they'll help us understand the true scale of what happened in post-war America. The tranquilizer epidemic wasn't a minor footnote in medical history. It was a massive social phenomenon that touched millions of lives and reshaped American culture in ways we're still understanding today. But before we move on to those statistics, let's delve deeper into the Hollywood phenomenon because it reveals so much about how medications become cultural objects. The relationship between the entertainment industry and pharmaceuticals didn't begin with Miltown, but it was transformed by it. Previous medications had been marketed primarily through medical channels. Doctors were the gatekeepers, and pharmaceutical companies focused their efforts on convincing physicians to prescribe. But Miltown demonstrated that cultural endorsement could be just as powerful, maybe more powerful than medical marketing. When audiences saw their favourite stars casually mentioning their tranquilizer use, something shifted in the collective consciousness. Consider the specific mechanics of how celebrity endorsement worked in this era. Television was still relatively new, and the intimacy of the medium created powerful parasocial relationships between viewers and stars. When Milton Berle joked about Miltown on his show, millions of Americans watching felt like they were getting advice from a trusted friend. This wasn't some distant movie star on a silver screen. This was someone who came into their living rooms every week, someone they felt they knew. The endorsement carried weight precisely because it seemed casual and unforced, not like the obviously scripted testimonials that characterized other forms of advertising. When a celebrity mentioned taking Miltown, it felt authentic, which made it incredibly persuasive. The architecture of 1950s celebrity culture amplified these effects. Fan magazines, which were enormously popular during this period, provided detailed coverage of stars' personal lives, including their health routines and medical choices. Articles with titles like How Hollywood Stays Calm would feature multiple stars discussing their stress management techniques, with Milltown frequently mentioned. These weren't advertisements, they were editorial content which gave them additional credibility in readers' minds. People trusted magazine articles in ways they didn't trust advertisements, so when these articles normalized tranquilizer use, the impact was significant. The specific celebrities associated with Milltown use is interesting to examine, though we should be careful about naming individuals since some of this information came through gossip channels rather than verified sources. What we can say is that the drug was reportedly popular among both male and female stars, among comedians and dramatic actors, among singers and directors. The broad adoption across different segments of the entertainment industry suggested that the drug's appeal transcended specific niches. This wasn't a medication for a particular type of person. It was for anyone dealing with the stresses of modern life, and who dealt with more stress than Hollywood celebrities. The studio system of the 1950s created particular pressures that made tranquilizers appealing to entertainment professionals. Actors were often under contract to studios that controlled nearly every aspect of their careers. They might be forced to take roles they didn't want, maintain images that didn't reflect their true personalities, and work punishing schedules with little control over their lives. The pressure to always appear perfect, always be on, always project the image the studio wanted. These demands took a toll on mental health. Tranquilizers offered a way to manage the resulting anxiety without visibly falling apart, without showing the cracks that might damage a carefully constructed public image. Female stars faced particular pressures that made them especially likely to turn to tranquilizers. The entertainment industry's standards for women were brutal. They had to be simultaneously glamorous and wholesome, sexy but not threatening, talented but not too ambitious. Weight monitoring was constant and often cruel, with studios sometimes putting actresses on dangerous diets or prescribing amphetamines for weight loss. The combination of stimulants during the day to stay thin and energetic, followed by sedatives at night to sleep and tranquilizers throughout to manage the anxiety of it all, this pharmaceutical cocktail became distressingly common among female entertainers. Milltown fit neatly into this chemical regimen, providing calm without the heavy sedation that might interfere with filming schedules. The party culture of Hollywood during this era created environments where pill sharing was normalized to a degree that seems reckless by modern standards. These gatherings weren't just social events, they were networking opportunities, business meetings disguised as leisure time. The pressure to perform socially, to be charming and witty, to make the right connections. All of this could be overwhelming, especially for people who are naturally introverted or prone to anxiety. Having a pill that could take the edge off, that could make you feel more confident and relaxed, was enormously appealing in these contexts. The fact that others at the party were doing the same thing removed any stigma. Taking your tranquilizer before a party became as routine as having a drink, just another preparation for social performance. The physical settings of these parties deserve description because they capture something essential about the era. These weren't basement gatherings or casual get-togethers. They were often held in lavish homes in Beverly Hills or Bel Air, with professionally catered food, full bars, and carefully curated guest lists. The contrast between the sophisticated setting and the casual pill distribution is striking. Crystal bowls that might hold candies in other homes held tranquilizers at these parties. Silver trays that might carry canapes also carried pills. The elegance of the presentation normalized what was happening, making pharmaceutical consumption seem like just another aspect of sophisticated living. Hostesses at these parties developed reputations for their hospitality, which sometimes included their pharmaceutical offerings. Being known as someone who provided quality tranquilizers to guests became a kind of social currency. "Oh, you should go to her parties, she always has the best Milltown." This might sound shocking to modern ears, but it was spoken about quite matter-of-factly in contemporary accounts. The normalization was so complete that people didn't seem to recognize how unusual it was. Or perhaps they did recognize it but didn't care. Caught up in a cultural moment where pharmaceutical enhancement of life seemed not just acceptable but desirable. The intersection of Milltown use with alcohol consumption at these parties is worth examining from a medical perspective, even though people at the time largely ignored the risks. Both alcohol and meprobamate depress the central nervous system, and when taken together, their effects can compound in unpredictable ways. The combination increases sedation, impairs coordination more than either substance alone, and can be dangerous or even fatal in extreme cases. Yet partygoers routinely mixed their martinis with their Milltown, apparently unconcerned about potential interactions. This casual attitude toward mixing substances reflected a broader ignorance about drug interactions that characterized the era. People trusted that if their doctor prescribed something, it must be safe, and they extended that trust to contexts that doctors never intended. The fashion industry picked up on the tranquilizer trend as well, which gives us another window into how thoroughly Milltown penetrated popular culture. Some designers created special accessories for carrying pills, elegant pill cases that could be carried in a purse or pocket, transforming medication transport into a fashion statement. These weren't the plastic pill organizers we might associate with elderly patients today. They were crafted from precious metals, sometimes decorated with gemstones, designed to be seen and admired. Pulling out a beautiful gold pill box to take your Milltown became a kind of social gesture, a demonstration of sophistication. The medication had transcended its purely functional purpose and become a lifestyle accessory. The language of advertising evolved to capture this new relationship with pharmaceuticals. Words like modern, sophisticated, and enlightened appeared in Milltown marketing, positioning the drug as something that forward-thinking people used. The framing suggested that taking tranquilizers wasn't a sign of weakness or illness. It was a sign of being smart enough to use available tools for self-improvement. This linguistic shift was subtle but powerful. Instead of treating medication as something people reluctantly took when they were sick, the marketing repositioned it as something savvy people proactively took to optimize their lives. This reframing has had lasting effects on how we think about pharmaceutical use. Medical advertisements of the period, particularly those in journals aimed at physicians, use sophisticated imagery to convey these messages. One common trope showed before and after scenarios: a distressed person struggling with their emotions transformed into a calm, capable individual after treatment. The before images typically showed someone overwhelmed, perhaps holding their head in their hands or looking anxious. The after images showed the same person confidently engaged in normal activities, working, socializing, caring for their family. The message was clear. Milltown could transform you from dysfunctional to functional, from anxious to calm, from struggling to succeeding. These images were compelling because they offered hope, a vision of what life could be like without the burden of constant anxiety. The print advertisements that appeared in general interest magazines took a different approach, since they couldn't directly advertise prescription medications to consumers. Instead, they often appeared as educational content about anxiety and stress, subtly promoting the idea that these were medical conditions requiring treatment. The advertisements might describe symptoms of anxiety: racing heart, sweating, difficulty concentrating, sleep problems, and encourage readers to consult their doctors. The implication was that if you experienced these symptoms, you had a medical condition that deserved treatment. Never mind that these symptoms are also normal human experiences that everyone has from time to time. The marketing pathologized ordinary emotions, creating the sense that if you weren't always calm and in control, something was wrong with you. This pathologization of normal anxiety had profound effects on American culture. Before the tranquilizer era, people generally expected to experience nervousness and worry as normal parts of life. You might feel anxious before a big event or worried during difficult times, but these feelings were seen as natural responses to life circumstances. You dealt with them through willpower, prayer, social support, maybe a stiff drink. But the tranquilizer marketing suggested that these feelings were medical symptoms that shouldn't be tolerated. Why suffer through anxiety when you could take a pill? Why struggle with nervousness when modern medicine offered solutions? The marketing didn't create anxiety. That had always existed. What it created was the expectation that anxiety was pathological and required pharmaceutical intervention. Children growing up in Milltown using households absorbed these attitudes, which would shape their own future relationships with medication. When kids saw their parents taking daily pills to manage their moods, they internalized the message that chemical mood management was normal and appropriate. These children would become adults in the 1960s and 70s, and they would be even more receptive to pharmaceutical marketing than their parents had been. The normalization was generational, each cohort more comfortable with psychiatric medication than the last. We can trace a direct line from the casual Milltown use of the 1950s to contemporary attitudes about antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. The geographic spread of Milltown use followed interesting patterns that reflected the drug's cultural associations. Initial adoption was concentrated in urban areas, particularly on the coasts where cultural trends typically originated. New York and Los Angeles were early centers of Milltown use, which makes sense given their concentration of entertainment industry professionals and trend-conscious populations. From these coastal centres, the drug spread inland, following the typical pattern of cultural diffusion. Smaller cities adopted the trend after larger ones, and rural areas were last to embrace the medication, if they embraced it at all. This geographic pattern was reinforced by media coverage. National magazines based in New York covered the Milltown phenomenon extensively, but their coverage naturally reflected urban coastal perspectives. Stories about Hollywood parties and Manhattan cocktail culture didn't necessarily resonate with readers in rural Iowa or small-town Alabama. This created a kind of cultural divide around tranquilizer use, with cosmopolitan areas embracing the trend while more traditional areas remained skeptical. The divide wasn't absolute. Plenty of rural Americans took Milltown, but the cultural meaning of the medication varied depending on location. Class dynamics also shaped Milltown use in important ways. The drug was expensive enough that working-class families might struggle to afford ongoing prescriptions, especially if they lacked good insurance coverage. Middle-class and upper-middle-class families had easier access, both financially and in terms of their relationship with healthcare. They were more likely to have regular physicians who could write prescriptions, more likely to have insurance that covered medications, more likely to be exposed to the cultural messaging that normalized tranquilizer use. This created class stratification in pharmaceutical consumption that mirrored broader social inequalities. The medical profession's approach to Milltown prescribing varied considerably depending on the physician and their practice setting. Urban physicians with affluent practices were often quick to prescribe, responding to patient demand and confident in the drug's safety based on available evidence. These doctors were likely to have read the positive reports in medical journals and to have attended conferences where Milltown was discussed favorably. They saw themselves as progressive practitioners offering their patients the benefits of modern medicine. Conversely, some rural or more conservative physicians remained cautious about Milltown. These doctors might have been skeptical of quick medical fixes or concerned about their patients becoming dependent on medication. They might have maintained older attitudes about dealing with anxiety through non-pharmaceutical means, exercise, faith, family support. These physicians were less likely to prescribe Milltown, and their patients therefore had less access to the medication. The variation in physician attitudes meant that your likelihood of receiving a Milltown prescription depended partly on where you lived and which doctor you saw. The insurance industry's role in facilitating the Milltown boom deserves more attention than it typically receives. As employer-provided health insurance became increasingly common in the 1950s, and as these insurance plans began covering prescription medications, the financial barrier to pharmaceutical consumption dropped significantly. Patients who might have balked at paying out of pocket for monthly prescriptions were more willing to take medications when insurance covered most of the cost. This removed one of the natural limiting factors on drug consumption, allowing prescription rates to climb higher than they might otherwise have reached. Insurance companies found themselves in an interesting position regarding Milltown coverage. On one hand, covering the medication made their plans more attractive to customers who wanted access to this popular drug. On the other hand, the sheer volume of prescriptions was driving up costs significantly. Some insurance executives began questioning whether they should be covering what seemed like lifestyle medications, rather than treatments for serious illness. These debates foreshadowed later conflicts about what constitutes necessary medical care versus optional pharmaceutical enhancement. The regulatory environment of the 1950s facilitated Milltown's rapid adoption in ways that would be impossible today. The FDA at that time had limited authority and resources compared to its current scope. Drug approval processes were less rigorous, with shorter trials and less emphasis on long-term safety data. Once a drug was approved, there was minimal post-market surveillance to track adverse effects or problematic patterns of use. This regulatory landscape meant that Milltown could reach the market and achieve massive penetration before anyone had a clear picture of its risks. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with the medical profession was also less scrutinized than it would later become. Drug company representatives had easy access to physicians, bringing samples and promotional materials directly into doctors' offices. The concept of conflicts of interest wasn't examined with the same rigor it would receive in later decades. Doctors saw nothing wrong with accepting gifts from pharmaceutical companies or relying on industry-provided information when making prescribing decisions. This cozy relationship between industry and medicine facilitated the rapid spread of new medications like Milltown. As the 1950s drew to a close, Milltown stood at the peak of its success. The drug had transformed from an experimental compound in Frank Berger's laboratory to a cultural icon that millions of Americans relied upon daily. The pharmaceutical industry had learned that blockbuster drugs were possible, that massive markets existed for medications that addressed everyday distress, and that cultural marketing could be as powerful as traditional medical promotion. Hollywood had demonstrated its influence over health behaviors, showing that celebrity endorsement could normalize practices that might otherwise seem unusual. American culture had embraced pharmaceutical solutions for emotional distress in ways unprecedented in human history. But even at this peak, the seeds of change were being planted. Researchers at other pharmaceutical companies were developing new compounds that would surpass meprobamate in potency and popularity. The benzodiazepines were coming, and they would make Milltown look like a rough draft for the tranquilizer revolution. Meanwhile, concerns about meprobamate dependency were accumulating, with reports of addiction and withdrawal that mirrored the problems that had plagued barbiturates. The medical profession, which had so eagerly embraced Milltown, was beginning to have second thoughts about the wisdom of mass-prescribing tranquilizers. The cultural moment that had made Milltown so successful was also evolving. The conformist 1950s were giving way to the questioning 1960s, and attitudes about pharmaceutical consumption would shift accordingly. The next generation would be simultaneously more comfortable with drug use generally, but more skeptical of pharmaceutical companies specifically. They would embrace recreational drugs while questioning medical establishment drug pushing. It was a complicated and somewhat contradictory shift in attitudes that would reshape the tranquilizer landscape. For now, though, we're still in the glow of Milltown's triumph. The drug has achieved unprecedented success, proving that Americans are willing and eager to medicate their anxieties, that cultural forces can powerfully shape pharmaceutical consumption, and that modern life creates stresses that people want chemical help managing. These lessons won't be forgotten by the pharmaceutical industry. If anything, they'll be applied more aggressively with the next generation of tranquilizers, leading to even more widespread use, and eventually more serious reckoning with the consequences. The Milltown story isn't just about one drug, it's about a fundamental shift in how Americans related to their emotions and to pharmaceutical intervention. It's about the medicalization of ordinary distress, the normalization of chemical mood management, the transformation of prescription medications into lifestyle products. These shifts didn't reverse when Milltown faded from prominence. If anything, they intensified with subsequent drugs and subsequent marketing campaigns. We're still living with the legacy of what began in those years, still navigating questions about when medication is appropriate, still dealing with pharmaceutical companies that market products aggressively, still grappling with celebrity influence over health behaviors. So as we prepare to move into the next sections of our story, carry with you what we've learned about Milltown's rise. The mechanisms that made it successful, scientific discovery, aggressive marketing, celebrity endorsement, cultural normalization, regulatory permissiveness, would all reappear with future medications. The tranquilizer epidemic didn't end with Milltown, it was just getting started. The quiet epidemic of post-war America was finding its rhythm, and the beat would only get stronger in the years to come. Hollywood had done its part transforming a pharmaceutical product into a cultural phenomenon, and the effects would ripple through American society for decades. We've seen how it happened, we've understood the forces at play, and now we're ready to see what came next. The numbers are coming, and they're going to blow your mind. But let's not leave the Hollywood story quite yet, because there are still fascinating aspects to explore about how the entertainment industry's embrace of tranquilizers reflected and shaped broader American culture. The entertainment industry has always served as a kind of cultural laboratory, where trends are amplified and disseminated to the broader public. What starts in Hollywood often spreads outward, and the tranquilizer phenomenon was no exception. The patterns of use we saw in the entertainment industry, the casual attitude toward pharmaceuticals, the mixing of pills with alcohol, the use of medications for lifestyle enhancement rather than medical necessity, all of these would become widespread American behaviors in the coming decades. The professional sports world, which had its own pressures and anxieties, also began embracing tranquilizers during this period, though with less public discussion than the entertainment industry. Athletes facing the stress of competition, the fear of injury, the anxiety of performance pressure, they were also prime candidates for medications that could calm nerves without impairing physical function. While we don't have the same rich documentation of tranquilizer use in sports that we have for Hollywood, contemporary accounts suggest that Milltown found its way into locker rooms and training facilities. The pressure to perform, whether on stage or on field, created similar motivations for pharmaceutical intervention. The academic world provides another interesting case study. College campuses during the late 1950s were experiencing their own form of pharmaceutical experimentation, with students and faculty members using tranquilizers to manage the stress of academic life. The pressure to produce scholarly work, to achieve tenure, to compete for grants and positions, these stresses drove some academics toward Milltown and similar medications. Graduate students pulling all-nighters, professors preparing for important presentations, researchers anxious about their findings, all found reasons to seek pharmaceutical calm. The irony of intellectuals drugging themselves to enhance their mental work wasn't lost on everyone, but the practice nonetheless spread. The business world's adoption of Milltown deserves particular attention because it illustrates how the medication became embedded in professional culture. Corporate America in the 1950s was intensely competitive, with the organizational man expected to climb the ladder through dedication, conformity, and unfailing competence. The pressure to always be in control, to never show weakness, to maintain a calm facade regardless of internal turmoil. These expectations created enormous anxiety for many corporate employees. Milltown offered a way to meet these demands, to appear calm and collected even when feeling anything but. The medication became a tool for corporate performance, helping executives maintain their professional personas. Business meetings of the era might feature multiple participants who had taken their morning Milltown, all presenting calm, controlled exteriors while discussing high-stakes decisions. The drug allowed people to participate in stressful situations without appearing stressed, which was valuable in a corporate culture that penalized visible anxiety. Of course, one might question whether important business decisions should be made by people whose emotional responses had been chemically muted, but that consideration didn't seem to trouble most users at the time. The ability to appear calm was valued over the potential costs of numbed emotions. The military also experimented with tranquilizers during this period, seeing potential applications for soldiers dealing with combat stress. Military physicians, like their civilian counterparts, were eager for medications that could help their patients without the problems associated with barbiturates. Soldiers suffering from anxiety, whether from combat exposure or the general stresses of military life, were prescribed Milltown and similar medications. The military's interest in these drugs would continue and expand with the introduction of benzodiazepines, leading to widespread use during the Vietnam War. The pattern of using tranquilizers to manage the psychological toll of warfare was being established in the late 1950s. Religious communities had varied responses to the tranquilizer phenomenon, responses that reveal the cultural tensions of the era. Some religious leaders embraced the medications as God-given tools for alleviating suffering, seeing no conflict between faith and pharmaceutical intervention. If God had allowed scientists to discover these compounds, wasn't using them simply accepting divine provision? Other religious figures were more skeptical, viewing tranquilizers as a form of escape from spiritual struggles that should be faced with prayer and faith. They argued that anxiety and suffering had spiritual dimensions that pills couldn't address, and that relying on medications might actually impede spiritual growth. These theological debates about pharmaceutical use continue to this day, though the specific medications have changed. The feminist implications of Milltown use were becoming apparent even before feminism emerged as an organized movement. Perceptive observers noticed that women were being prescribed tranquilizers at higher rates than men, and that the medications were being used to help women adjust to social roles that made them unhappy. This represented a kind of chemical enforcement of gender norms. If women were dissatisfied with their domestic confinement, the solution wasn't to expand their opportunities, but to medicate their dissatisfaction. Betty Friedan and other proto-feminist thinkers would later point to this pattern as evidence of how pharmaceutical intervention could serve conservative social purposes, literally drugging women into acceptance of limiting roles. The racial dynamics of tranquilizer access during this period reflected broader healthcare inequalities. African Americans and other minority groups had less access to healthcare generally, and this extended to psychiatric medications. Segregated healthcare systems meant that black patients might not have the same access to physicians who would prescribe Milltown, might not be able to afford the medication, and might face additional stigma around mental health treatment. This created a situation where the benefits and risks of tranquilizers were unevenly distributed across racial lines. The problems with overprescription affected primarily white middle-class populations, while minority communities often had limited access to psychiatric care of any kind. International observers watching America's tranquilizer consumption were often bemused by the phenomenon. European commentators wrote articles questioning why Americans needed so many pills, viewing the trend as evidence of American excess and shallow culture. French intellectuals particularly enjoyed mocking American pharmaceutical dependency, seeing it as emblematic of a culture that sought easy solutions to complex human problems. British observers were more measured but still surprised by the scale of American consumption. These international perspectives provide useful distance on the phenomenon, helping us see how unusual the American embrace of tranquilizers really was. The pharmaceutical industry's reaction to Milltown's success went beyond simply trying to develop competing products. The success demonstrated that there were enormous profits to be made in medications for chronic conditions affecting large populations. This realization would reshape pharmaceutical research priorities for decades to come. Instead of focusing primarily on curing acute diseases, companies increasingly invested in medications that people would take indefinitely. Drugs for high blood pressure, cholesterol, anxiety, depression. The blockbuster drug model, where a single medication could generate billions in revenue, was born with Milltown and would dominate pharmaceutical strategy going forward. The legal implications of Milltown's widespread use were beginning to emerge as the 1950s ended. Courts were dealing with cases involving people who had committed crimes while under the influence of tranquilizers, and the legal system struggled to determine culpability. If someone's judgment was impaired by medication prescribed by their doctor, were they fully responsible for their actions? What about people who caused car accidents while taking Milltown? Could they claim the medication affected their driving ability? These legal questions didn't have clear answers, and courts often made inconsistent rulings. The legal framework for understanding prescription drug influence on behavior was being established in real time. Insurance companies were also grappling with the implications of mass tranquilizer use. When someone taking Milltown was involved in an accident, did their medication use affect insurance coverage? Could insurance companies refuse to cover accidents if they could prove the person had taken tranquilizers? These questions had significant financial implications and led to policy discussions within the insurance industry. Some companies began including clauses in their policies about prescription drug use, trying to limit their exposure to claims involving medication-impaired individuals. The media's role in the Milltown phenomenon continued to evolve as the decade ended. Early coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, treating the drug as a wonder medication that was helping millions of Americans cope with modern life. But by the late 1950s, some journalists were beginning to ask harder questions. Investigative pieces examined the potential for addiction, questioned the wisdom of mass medication, and explored whether pharmaceutical companies had been entirely honest about their products' risks. This shift in media coverage foreshadowed the more critical journalism that would emerge in the 1960s and 70s, when faith in institutions including pharmaceutical companies would erode significantly. The advertising industry itself was transformed by its experience with Milltown. Advertisers had learned powerful lessons about how to market medications, lessons that went beyond traditional product promotion. They discovered the power of aspirational messaging, positioning products not as cures for illness but as tools for achieving ideal versions of oneself. They'd learned how celebrity association could normalize behaviors and products. They'd understood how to create demand by pathologizing normal experiences. These techniques would be applied not just to future pharmaceutical products but to consumer goods generally. The sophisticated marketing that characterizes modern consumer culture owes something to what was learned during the Milltown era. The psychological research community was also influenced by the tranquilizer phenomenon. Psychologists and psychiatrists studying the effects of Milltown were learning about the pharmacology of anxiety in ways that hadn't been possible before. Having a medication that could reliably reduce anxiety provided a tool for research, allowing scientists to explore questions about the neurobiological basis of anxiety and the relationship between physical brain states and emotional experiences. This research would eventually lead to more sophisticated understanding of anxiety disorders and more targeted treatments. The tranquilizer era, for all its problems, did advance scientific knowledge about psychiatric conditions. As we truly prepare to close this chapter on Milltown and Hollywood, let's appreciate the historical significance of what we've explored. In just a few years, from 1955 to the end of the decade, American culture was fundamentally transformed. A small pharmaceutical company's experimental compound became a cultural touchstone. Hollywood celebrities turned psychiatric medication into a status symbol. Millions of Americans were convinced that their ordinary anxieties were medical conditions requiring treatment. The pharmaceutical industry discovered the blockbuster drug model that would dominate for decades. The relationship between celebrity culture and health behaviors was established in ways that persist today. These weren't minor changes. They represented a fundamental shift in how our society understood emotion, medication, and the appropriate use of chemistry to manage human experience. The legacy of this period extends far beyond the specific drugs involved. We're still dealing with questions that were first raised during the Milltown era. When is medication appropriate for anxiety? How should we balance the benefits of pharmaceutical intervention against the risks of dependency? What role should marketing play in driving medication use? How do we distinguish between treating genuine illness and medicating away normal human experience? These questions don't have easy answers, and we continue to grapple with them every time a new psychiatric medication is introduced. The Hollywood aspect of the story is particularly relevant today, when celebrity health behaviors are amplified through social media in ways that 1950s stars couldn't have imagined. When modern celebrities discuss their medication use, their mental health struggles, their treatment approaches, they're participating in a tradition that began with Milton Berle joking about Milltown. The power of celebrity to normalize and promote health behaviors hasn't diminished. If anything, it's increased as social media creates even more intimate connections between stars and their audiences. So there we have it, the complete story of Milltown's rise and Hollywood's role in transforming a prescription medication into a cultural phenomenon. We've seen how Frank Berger's laboratory observation led to pharmaceutical history, how a small company struck gold with a new compound, and how the entertainment industry amplified the drug's success beyond what traditional marketing could have achieved. We've explored the gender dynamics, the class implications, the cultural meanings embedded in tranquilizer use. We've understood how American culture shifted to embrace chemical mood management, and we've glimpsed the problems that were beginning to emerge even at Milltown's peak. The tranquilizer epidemic is still in its early stages in our narrative. Milltown was just the beginning, the proof of concept that demonstrated both the demand for anti-anxiety medication and the cultural willingness to embrace pharmaceutical solutions. What comes next will dwarf Milltown in scale and impact. The benzodiazepines are waiting in the wings, ready to take the tranquilizer revolution to heights that even Milltown's success couldn't have predicted. But we'll get to those drugs in due time. For now, we've thoroughly explored the Milltown moment, understood its significance, and prepared ourselves for what's to come. The numbers from this era still astound. 1 billion tablets, 1 in 20 Americans, sales growing exponentially. In the next chapter, we'll dive deep into those statistics, examining exactly how widespread tranquilizer use became and what those numbers meant for American society. The scope of the epidemic will become clear when we look at the hard data, and you'll understand why historians consider this one of the most significant pharmaceutical phenomena in history. The quiet epidemic won't be quiet for much longer, and the statistics will tell the story in ways that anecdotes alone cannot convey. So settle in, take a breath, and prepare for the numbers. We've seen the cultural story, we've understood the Hollywood phenomenon, we've explored the social dynamics. Now it's time to quantify what happened, to see the epidemic in statistical terms that reveal its true magnitude. The tranquilizer story is far from over. In fact, we're just getting to the heart of it. Stay with me as we continue exploring this fascinating chapter in American medical history, because the story keeps getting more interesting, more complicated, and more relevant to understanding our modern relationship with pharmaceutical intervention. Let's talk numbers, because the statistics of the tranquilizer epidemic are so staggering that they deserve their own focused examination. We've been discussing millions of users and billions of tablets in somewhat abstract terms, but when you actually sit down and do the math, when you really examine what these figures meant for American society, the scope of what happened becomes almost incomprehensible. So let's dive into the data, because the numbers tell a story that's even more dramatic than the Hollywood parties and celebrity endorsements we explored in the last chapter. Start with Milltown's first month on the market in 1955. Sales totaled approximately $7,500. That's not a typo, $7,500. For a pharmaceutical product, that's essentially a rounding error, the kind of performance that would have most companies questioning their investment. Carter Products had poured resources into developing and marketing this new medication, and their first month's return wouldn't even cover the salary of a single executive. If you were an investor looking at those numbers, you might have felt a twinge of concern. Had the company made a mistake? Was this tranquilizer thing not going to work out after all? Fast forward just 1 year. By the end of 1956, Milltown sales had multiplied so dramatically that the initial numbers seemed almost quaint. The drug was generating millions of dollars monthly, and Carter Products couldn't produce tablets fast enough to meet demand. Their manufacturing facilities ran around the clock, and still pharmacies reported shortages. Patients were calling their doctors in panic when they couldn't get their refills, so dependent had they become on their daily doses. The company that had started with $7,500 in first-month sales was now swimming in profits that exceeded their most optimistic projections. By 1957, Americans were consuming over 1 billion Miltown tablets annually. 1 billion. Let's break that down to really appreciate what it means. The United States population in 1957 was approximately 172 million people. That means the country was consuming about 6 tablets per person per year, man, woman, and child included. Of course, children weren't taking Miltown and many adults weren't either. So among actual users, the consumption rates were much higher. Some patients were taking multiple tablets daily, meaning they might consume over 1,000 tablets per year individually. When you account for the fact that only a portion of the population was using the drug, the per-user consumption becomes truly remarkable. The 1 in 20 statistic gets cited frequently in discussions of the Miltown era, and it's worth examining carefully. By the late 1950s, roughly 5% of the American population was regularly taking Miltown or related meprobamate products. 5% sounds modest until you realize what it represents in absolute numbers. 5% of 172 million is about 8.6 million people. That's 8.6 million Americans taking a psychiatric medication regularly, many of them daily. For context, that's more than the entire population of New York City at the time. Imagine every single person in America's largest city taking tranquilizers, and you start to grasp the scale. But the 1 in 20 figure was an average across the entire population. In certain demographics, the rates were much higher. Among middle-class white women in suburban areas, the demographic most heavily targeted by pharmaceutical marketing, usage rates approached 15 to 20% in some studies. That means in certain communities, 1 in 5 or 6 women was taking tranquilizers regularly. Picture a suburban block of houses, each containing a family. In every 5th or 6th house, the woman of the household was taking Miltown to get through her day. This wasn't a fringe behavior or something that social outcasts did. This was mainstream, normalized, expected. The age distribution of users provides additional insight. While Miltown use spanned age groups, the highest rates were among middle-aged adults, particularly those between 35 and 55. These were people in the thick of life's responsibilities, raising children, building careers, managing households, caring for aging parents. The stresses they faced were real, and the medication offered an apparently easy solution. Younger adults used tranquilizers less frequently, perhaps because they hadn't yet accumulated the life stresses that drove older adults toward medication, or perhaps because their social circles hadn't yet normalized the behavior. Older adults also showed lower usage rates, possibly reflecting generational attitudes toward medication or different stress profiles. Geographic patterns in Miltown consumption mapped onto broader cultural and economic factors. Urban areas showed higher usage rates than rural regions, with the coasts leading consumption. California and New York had the highest per capita tranquilizer use, which makes sense given their urban populations, cultural progressiveness, and concentration of trend-setting industries. The Midwest showed moderate usage, while the Deep South had the lowest rates, possibly reflecting conservative attitudes towards psychiatric medication and limited healthcare access in rural areas. These patterns would persist and even intensify with the introduction of benzodiazepines. The economic impact of this mass consumption was substantial. The tranquilizer market, essentially non-existent before 1955, was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually by the end of the decade. Carter Products had transformed from a modest company into a major pharmaceutical player, their stock price multiplying many times over. The success attracted intense competition, with other pharmaceutical companies rushing to develop their own tranquilizers or license meprobamate for their own brands. The money flowing into the tranquilizer market reshaped the pharmaceutical industry's priorities, demonstrating that psychiatric medications could be enormously profitable and directing research investment towards similar compounds. Insurance companies bore significant costs as they covered tranquilizer prescriptions for millions of policyholders. The sheer volume of prescriptions meant that even modest per-prescription costs added up to substantial total expenditures. Some insurance executives began questioning whether tranquilizers should be covered under standard prescription drug benefits, arguing that they were being used for lifestyle enhancement rather than medical necessity. But removing coverage would have been deeply unpopular with customers, so the coverage continued and the costs mounted. Healthcare system utilization patterns shifted in response to tranquilizer availability. Doctors reported that significant portions of their office visits involved patients seeking tranquilizer prescriptions or refills. Some physicians complained that they had become little more than prescription writing machines, seeing patients briefly just to renew their Miltown. The 15-minute doctor visit, which has become standard in American healthcare, arguably has roots in this era when physicians were processing large volumes of patients seeking pharmaceutical solutions for their anxieties. The pharmacy industry was also transformed. Tranquilizers became one of the most profitable product categories, with pharmacies ordering large quantities to meet consistent demand. Some pharmacies reported that tranquilizers represented a significant percentage of their total sales, sometimes 10% or more of revenue. Pharmacists became accustomed to filling these prescriptions routinely, viewing tranquilizers as just another medication category. The critical eye that might have been cast on unusual prescribing patterns was dulled by the sheer normality of tranquilizer distribution. Let's pause here to consider what these numbers meant for individual lives, because statistics can be dehumanizing if we're not careful. Each of those 1 billion tablets was swallowed by a person who was seeking relief from something: anxiety, stress, insomnia, emotional pain. 8 million Americans weren't taking tranquilizers because it was fun. They were taking them because they were struggling with something in their lives and had been told, by their doctors and by their culture, that this medication would help. The epidemic wasn't just about numbers, it was about millions of individual stories of distress and the search for relief. The prescribing patterns reveal something important about how tranquilizers were being used. Analysis of prescription data shows that many users received their tranquilizers from general practitioners rather than psychiatrists. This suggests that most tranquilizer use was for what we might call everyday anxiety, the stresses of work, family, modern life, rather than severe psychiatric conditions. General practitioners, with their 15-minute appointments and limited psychiatric training, were the primary gatekeepers for these powerful medications. They were doing their best to help their patients, but they often lacked the expertise to carefully evaluate whether medication was the best approach or to monitor for signs of dependency. Refill patterns indicate that tranquilizer use was often long-term rather than short-term. Once someone started taking Miltown, they tended to continue, often indefinitely. Prescriptions were renewed month after month, year after year, with little apparent effort to taper off or discontinue. This pattern suggests that either the underlying anxiety wasn't being addressed, or that patients had become dependent on the medication and couldn't easily stop. Either way, the long-term nature of use contributed to the massive consumption figures and raised questions about whether tranquilizers were really solving problems or just creating new ones. Now, just as Miltown was reaching peak market penetration, just as the tranquilizer epidemic was hitting its stride, something remarkable happened in a laboratory at Hoffmann-La Roche in New Jersey. A Polish-born chemist named Leo Sternbach was about to accidentally discover a compound that would make Miltown look like a warm-up act. The benzodiazepines were coming, and they would take the tranquilizer revolution to heights that even Miltown's most enthusiastic proponents couldn't have imagined. Sternbach's story is one of those wonderful examples of serendipity in science, where careful preparation meets happy accident to produce transformative results. Sternbach had been working on developing new tranquilizers for Roche, trying to create compounds that might compete with Miltown's market dominance. His approach was methodical. He'd been synthesizing variations of a class of chemicals called benzeptoxdiazines, testing each one for pharmacological activity. He'd created dozens of these compounds, none of which showed particularly promising results. By 1957, his supervisors at Roche were losing patience. The project wasn't producing results, and the company was considering shutting it down and reassigning Sternbach to other work. Then something interesting happened. During a laboratory cleanup, which, let's be honest, is not usually where scientific breakthroughs occur, Sternbach and his team discovered a compound they'd synthesized earlier, but never actually tested. This compound, with the unwieldy chemical name chlordiazepoxide, had been sitting in a drawer, forgotten in the rush of other experiments. Sternbach, perhaps feeling pressure from his supervisor's impatience, decided to test this neglected compound before completely abandoning his research project. What he found was remarkable. Chlordiazepoxide showed strong sedative, anti-anxiety and muscle relaxant properties in animal tests, but with characteristics that distinguished it from both barbiturates and meprobamate. The compound seemed more potent than meprobamate, requiring smaller doses to achieve similar effects. It also appeared to have a wider safety margin, meaning the gap between an effective dose and a toxic dose was larger than with previous medications. The animals remained calm and functional at therapeutic doses, showing the kind of tranquilization that had made Miltown successful, but potentially with better safety characteristics. Sternbach had stumbled upon an entirely new class of compounds, the benzodiazepines. The chemical structure was different from anything that had come before, and this structural novelty translated into pharmacological differences as well. Benzodiazepines worked through a specific mechanism in the brain, enhancing the effects of a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. This mechanism wasn't fully understood at the time of discovery, but it would eventually be elucidated, providing insight into why benzodiazepines had such potent anti-anxiety effects. Roche, suddenly very interested in Sternbach's previously disappointing project, fast-tracked development of chlordiazepoxide. The compound went through clinical trials with impressive results. Patients reported significant relief from anxiety symptoms, often with fewer side effects than they'd experienced with meprobamate or barbiturates. Doctors were enthusiastic about the new medication, seeing it as a genuine improvement over existing options. The trials suggested that chlordiazepoxide was both more effective and safer than Miltown, exactly the combination that the pharmaceutical industry and medical profession had been seeking. The FDA approved chlordiazepoxide in 1960, and Roche brought it to market under the brand name Librium. The name was reportedly derived from equilibrium, suggesting the balanced state of mind the drug was supposed to provide. The marketing positioned Librium as a superior alternative to existing tranquilizers, emphasizing its potency and safety profile. Roche's marketing department, well-funded and sophisticated, launched comprehensive campaigns targeting both physicians and indirectly the general public. They'd learned from Miltown's success and were determined to capture the tranquilizer market for themselves. But even as Librium was being prepared for market, Sternbach was already working on refinements. He'd noticed that chlordiazepoxide, while effective, had some properties that might be improved. The compound wasn't particularly stable chemically, which could cause problems in manufacturing and storage. Sternbach went back to his laboratory and began modifying the benzodiazepine structure, creating variations to see if he could produce something even better. In 1959, actually before Librium even reached the market, Sternbach synthesized diazepam, another benzodiazepine compound that would prove even more significant than chlordiazepoxide. Diazepam was more potent than chlordiazepoxide, chemically more stable, and had a longer duration of action. In many ways, it was the perfected version of what Sternbach had been trying to create. When Roche realized what Sternbach had produced, they immediately began development work on this new compound as well, planning to bring it to market as a follow-up to Librium. Diazepam would eventually be marketed as Valium, a name derived from the Latin valere, meaning to be strong or to be well. The naming was deliberate. Valium suggested strength, wellness, capability. Someone taking Valium wasn't admitting weakness. They were taking steps to be well and strong. This linguistic framing would prove important for the drug's acceptance and success. The marketing geniuses at Roche understood that how you named and positioned a product mattered as much as the product itself. Librium's market entry in 1960 was immediately successful, though not quite at the explosive rate of Miltown's initial uptake. Physicians, perhaps slightly more cautious after their experience with widespread Miltown prescribing, were initially measured in their adoption of the new medication. But as positive reports accumulated and as patients who'd tried Librium praised its effectiveness, prescriptions increased steadily. By the end of its first year on the market, Librium was being prescribed to hundreds of thousands of patients, and the numbers were climbing rapidly. The transition from meprobamate to benzodiazepines wasn't immediate or complete. Miltown continued to be widely prescribed throughout the early 1960s, with many patients who were satisfied with their medication seeing no reason to switch. But for new patients seeking tranquilizers, and for those whose doctors recommended trying the newer medication, benzodiazepines increasingly became the choice. The pharmaceutical industry had successfully obsoleted its own product, replacing one blockbuster with another even more potent one. Valium received FDA approval in 1963 and quickly began its ascent toward pharmaceutical superstardom. If Librium was successful, Valium would be legendary. The drug seemed to be everything doctors and patients wanted. Effective against anxiety, muscle spasms, and insomnia, with a relatively good side effect profile and duration of action that allowed for convenient dosing. Patients reported feeling calm and capable, able to handle stresses that had previously overwhelmed them. Doctors appreciated having a medication they could prescribe with confidence, backed by what seemed like solid safety data. The numbers for benzodiazepine consumption would eventually dwarf even Miltown's impressive statistics, but that story belongs to later chapters. For now, we're watching the seeds being planted, watching as the pharmaceutical industry learned from its Miltown experience and prepared to apply those lessons at even greater scale. The benzodiazepine revolution was beginning, and it would reshape the tranquilizer landscape in ways that would have profound implications for American society. What's particularly interesting about the transition from meprobamate to benzodiazepines is how it revealed the underlying dynamics of pharmaceutical markets. The medical establishment had embraced Miltown enthusiastically, prescribing it to millions of patients despite limited long-term safety data. When concerns about meprobamate dependency began emerging in the late 1950s, the response wasn't to become more cautious about prescribing tranquilizers generally. Instead, the response was to switch to newer tranquilizers that were marketed as safer. The pattern would repeat itself: embrace a new drug enthusiastically, prescribe it widely, gradually recognize problems, then switch to the next new drug that promised to solve those problems. It was a cycle that benefited pharmaceutical companies enormously, while leaving patients to deal with the consequences of serial medication experimentation. The scientific community's understanding of how these medications worked was evolving, though it remained incomplete. Researchers were beginning to understand that tranquilizers worked by affecting brain chemistry, specifically by enhancing inhibitory neurotransmission. The benzodiazepines' mechanism of action on GABA receptors was being elucidated, providing a more detailed picture than was available for meprobamate, whose exact mechanism remained somewhat mysterious. This increased scientific understanding lent an air of respectability to benzodiazepine prescribing. Doctors could explain to patients in scientific terms how these medications affected brain function, which made the whole enterprise seem more legitimate and medically grounded. The marketing of benzodiazepines built on the lessons learned from Miltown while adding new sophistication. Roche's advertising campaigns were comprehensive and strategic, targeting physicians through medical journal advertisements that emphasized the drug's efficacy and safety. These ads featured images of calm, functional patients, business executives making important decisions, housewives managing their homes with ease, students performing well on exams. The message was clear. Benzodiazepines could help people perform their roles more effectively, could remove the impediment of anxiety from their functioning. The medications were positioned not as treatments for illness but as tools for optimization. The language used in these advertisements is particularly revealing. Terms like relief from anxiety and return to normal functioning appeared frequently, framing anxiety as an abnormality to be corrected rather than a normal human experience to be navigated. The ads promised that patients could be themselves again, as if anxiety had stolen their true identities and medication could restore them. This framing was powerful because it resonated with how patients felt. They often did feel like anxiety was preventing them from being their best selves. But it also medicalized what might be normal responses to genuinely stressful circumstances. Some advertisements directly compared benzodiazepines to older medications, highlighting their advantages. Safer than barbiturates, more effective than meprobamate was a common theme. These comparative claims positioned the new drugs as improvements over previous options, encouraging doctors to upgrade their prescribing. The ads rarely mentioned that the new drugs might have their own problems, that their safety profiles weren't fully understood, or that dependency might be an issue. The focus was relentlessly positive, emphasizing benefits while minimizing or ignoring potential risks. The reach of these marketing campaigns was extensive. Roche reportedly spent more on marketing Valium than had ever been spent on any single pharmaceutical product up to that time. Medical journals were filled with advertisements, pharmaceutical representatives visited doctors' offices regularly with samples and promotional materials, and medical conferences featured company-sponsored presentations on benzodiazepine therapy. The investment in marketing reflected the enormous potential profits at stake. If Roche could capture the tranquilizer market, the returns would be extraordinary. The medical profession's reception of benzodiazepines was generally enthusiastic, though some cautious voices urged restraint. Physicians who had lived through the barbiturate problems and were now seeing issues with meprobamate dependency naturally wondered whether the new drugs would prove similarly problematic. These skeptics pointed out that the long-term effects of benzodiazepines weren't known, that widespread prescribing was essentially a large-scale experiment on the public, and that the pharmaceutical industry's reassurances about safety should be viewed skeptically given their track record. But these cautious voices were overwhelmed by the majority who saw benzodiazepines as genuine improvements and eagerly prescribed them. Patient acceptance of the new medications was also strong. Those who had taken Miltown and found it helpful were often willing to try benzodiazepines on their doctor's recommendation. Those new to tranquilizers found benzodiazepines effective for their anxiety and appreciated the relatively mild side effect profiles. Word of mouth spread, as it had with Miltown, with patients recommending the medications to friends and family members. The cultural normalization of tranquilizer use that had occurred during the Milltown era meant that people had fewer reservations about starting benzodiazepine therapy. The demographic patterns of benzodiazepine use largely mirrored those of Milltown, though with some notable differences. Women continued to receive prescriptions at higher rates than men, a pattern that reflected both genuine prescribing biases and the fact that women were more likely to seek help for anxiety symptoms. Middle-class and upper-middle-class populations continued to have highest usage rates, as they had the healthcare access and insurance coverage to obtain these medications easily. Urban areas continued to lead rural regions in consumption. However, benzodiazepine use would eventually spread more broadly across demographic groups than Milltown had, partly because the drugs would be available for a longer period and partly because of even more aggressive marketing. The early 1960s represented a transitional period in the tranquilizer epidemic. Milltown was still widely used but facing increasing competition from benzodiazepines. Librium was establishing itself in the market while Valium waited in the wings for its upcoming launch. Concerns about tranquilizer dependency were growing, but hadn't yet reached a critical mass that would force reconsideration of prescribing practices. The pharmaceutical industry was learning that they could profit enormously from drugs that people took long-term for chronic conditions, and they were applying these lessons systematically. The numbers from this transitional period tell an interesting story. Total tranquilizer prescriptions continued to climb, even as the market shifted from meprobamate to benzodiazepines. It wasn't that people were taking fewer tranquilizers, it was that they were taking different tranquilizers. The underlying demand for anti-anxiety medication remained strong, fueled by the cultural normalization that had occurred during the Milltown era, and by ongoing pharmaceutical marketing. The specific brand names changed, but the fundamental pattern of mass psychiatric medication consumption continued unabated. Pharmacies during this period stocked both meprobamate and benzodiazepine products, serving patients whose doctors had different preferences or who were at different stages of transitioning to newer medications. Some pharmacists reported that tranquilizers as a category remained their most profitable product line, even as individual brand shares shifted. The infrastructure for mass tranquilizer distribution remained firmly in place, ready to accommodate whatever new compounds the pharmaceutical industry developed. The insurance industry continued grappling with the costs of covering these medications. Benzodiazepines were generally more expensive than meprobamate, reflecting their patent protection and aggressive pricing by Roche. This meant that even though the number of prescriptions was similar, the total costs were higher. Insurance executives debated various approaches to controlling these costs: formulary restrictions, prior authorization requirements, cost-sharing arrangements, but none of these were widely implemented during the early 1960s. The costs continued to mount. The regulatory environment remained largely permissive during this period. The FDA had approved the new benzodiazepines based on clinical trial data that showed efficacy and relative safety, but the trials were short-term and couldn't capture the dependency issues that would emerge with long-term use. Post-market surveillance was minimal, meaning that problems with the drugs might take years to be recognized and even longer to be addressed. The regulatory framework wasn't designed for medications that millions of people would take indefinitely, and this mismatch between regulatory approach and actual drug use patterns created gaps through which problems could slip. International patterns of benzodiazepine adoption varied, with some countries embracing the new medications as enthusiastically as the United States, while others were more cautious. The United Kingdom saw significant benzodiazepine prescribing, though National Health Service controls meant that the patterns were somewhat different than in America's fee-for-service system. European countries generally showed lower per capita consumption than the United States, reflecting different cultural attitudes and healthcare systems. Japan remained more conservative about psychiatric medication, cultural stigma continuing to limit adoption. These international differences highlight that the tranquilizer epidemic, while international in scope, was most intense in the United States due to specific cultural and structural factors. The scientific research on benzodiazepines during this early period was focused primarily on documenting their effectiveness and understanding their mechanism of action. Less attention was paid to long-term safety, dependency potential, or optimal prescribing practices. The research that was conducted was often funded by pharmaceutical companies, which created potential conflicts of interest. Researchers funded by Roche to study Librium and Valium might have been unconsciously biased toward finding positive results, or might have designed studies in ways that emphasized benefits over risks. This industry-funded research, while valuable, needed to be viewed with appropriate skepticism. Independent researchers who raised concerns about potential problems with benzodiazepines found their work less likely to be published in major journals or to receive attention at medical conferences. The dominant narrative was one of enthusiasm about these new medications, and dissenting voices were marginalized. This pattern of silencing criticism would have consequences later, when the problems with benzodiazepines became undeniable. But in the early 1960s, the cheerleading voices drowned out the skeptics. As we prepare to close this chapter on the statistics of consumption and the benzodiazepine revolution, let's appreciate the scope of what was happening. In less than a decade, Americans had gone from essentially no tranquilizer use to consuming billions of tablets annually. The pharmaceutical industry had learned to create and market psychiatric blockbusters, generating enormous profits while fundamentally changing how society understood and treated anxiety. A new class of drugs, the benzodiazepines, had emerged that would prove even more popular and more problematic than their predecessors. The stage was set for the next phase of the tranquilizer epidemic, one that would see consumption reach heights that would astound even those who had lived through the Milltown years. The numbers we've examined, the $7,500 first month growing to billions in sales, the billion tablets consumed annually, the 1 in 20 Americans on tranquilizers, these aren't just statistics. They represent a fundamental shift in how American society dealt with emotional distress. We had gone from a culture where people coped with anxiety through willpower, faith and social support to one where millions routinely turned to pharmaceutical intervention. Whether this represented progress or a problematic medicalization of normal human experience remains debated today. But the numbers make clear that whatever it was, it happened on a massive scale, transforming American culture and healthcare in ways that continue to shape our world. The benzodiazepine revolution was just beginning as our story reaches this point. Librium was establishing itself, Valium was about to launch, and the true golden age of tranquilizers, the Valium era of the late 1960s and 1970s, lay just ahead. The numbers we've discussed so far would be dwarfed by what was coming. The pharmaceutical industry had learned its lessons well from Milltown, and they were about to apply those lessons with unprecedented effectiveness. The quiet epidemic was about to get much, much bigger, and we're just getting to the part where the story really takes off. Stay with me as we continue exploring this remarkable chapter in American medical history, because what comes next will challenge everything we think we know about medical progress, pharmaceutical marketing, and the chemical management of human emotion. The transition we've witnessed, from barbiturates to meprobamate to benzodiazepines, represents a pattern that would repeat itself throughout pharmaceutical history. Each new drug class is introduced as safer and better than its predecessors, is embraced enthusiastically by the medical profession and public, achieves massive market penetration, and eventually reveals problems that weren't apparent during initial enthusiasm. The cycle creates winners, pharmaceutical companies at least financially, and losers, patients who develop dependency or experience adverse effects, while never quite solving the underlying human problems that drove people to seek medication in the first place. Understanding this pattern helps us see the tranquilizer epidemic not as an isolated historical incident, but as an example of recurring dynamics in pharmaceutical development and marketing. So take these numbers with you as we move forward. The billions of tablets, the millions of users, the hundreds of millions of dollars in profits. They'll provide context for understanding what came next, when Valium would ascend to become the most prescribed medication in America, and when the tranquilizer epidemic would reach its full flowering. We've laid the groundwork, we've traced the evolution from Milltown to benzodiazepines, we've quantified the scope of consumption. Now we're ready to enter the golden age of tranquilizers, when Valium would rule supreme, and when the consequences of mass medication would become impossible to ignore. The story is far from over. In fact, we're just getting to the most dramatic parts. So settle in, let the numbers sink in, and prepare yourself for what's coming next. The tranquilizer epidemic is about to reach heights that will astound you, and the story of how it got there is going to be quite a ride. But before we move on, let's spend more time with the statistics, because they reveal so much about what was happening in American society. The raw numbers, billions of tablets, millions of users, are impressive, but they become even more meaningful when we examine them in context. Consider, for instance, what these consumption patterns meant for American households. In a typical middle-class suburban neighborhood, tranquilizers had become as commonplace as coffee or aspirin. They sat in medicine cabinets across the country, a silent testimony to the anxieties that lurked beneath the surface of prosperous post-war America. The financial burden of this mass medication was substantial, even in an era of relative prosperity. A typical Milltown prescription might cost several dollars per month, which doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by 8 million regular users. The national expenditure on tranquilizers was reaching into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, money that was flowing from families to pharmacies to pharmaceutical companies. For individual households, especially those where multiple family members were taking medications, the cost could be significant. Some families were spending more on tranquilizers than they were on entertainment or savings. The employment implications of widespread tranquilizer use are fascinating to consider. Millions of Americans were going to work each day with their anxiety chemically managed. They were making important decisions, operating machinery, caring for patients, teaching children, all while under the influence of centrally acting medications. The workplace safety implications alone should have been concerning, but they were rarely discussed. If someone taking Milltown made a mistake at work, was the medication partly responsible? If a bus driver on tranquilizers had slower reaction times, should that be a concern? These questions were largely unasked because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging the scale of pharmaceutical impairment in the American workforce. The medical system was being reshaped by tranquilizer demand in ways that extended beyond simple prescription writing. Medical education was beginning to incorporate more pharmacology training, recognizing that medications were becoming central to medical practice. Medical school curricula that had once emphasized careful patient examination and holistic treatment were increasingly focusing on pharmacological interventions. Young doctors were learning that for most complaints there was a pill that could help. This shift in medical education would have long-lasting effects, producing generations of physicians who viewed prescribing as their primary therapeutic tool. Hospital pharmacies were adapting to serve the new medication landscape. Formularies were expanding to include various tranquilizer options, giving hospital physicians choices among different meprobamate and benzodiazepine products. Hospital protocols were developed for tranquilizer use in various clinical situations: preoperative anxiety, alcohol withdrawal, agitation in psychiatric patients. The medications were being integrated into standard medical practice across different settings and conditions. The pharmaceutical sales representative profession was growing and professionalizing during this period, largely in response to the tranquilizer market. These representatives, sometimes called detail men at the time, visited doctors' offices regularly to promote their company's products. They brought samples, promotional materials, and carefully crafted talking points emphasizing their drugs' benefits. The relationship between these representatives and physicians became increasingly important, with doctors often relying on them for information about new medications. This reliance created obvious potential for bias, but it was accepted as standard practice. The advertising industry itself was transformed by pharmaceutical marketing budgets. Agencies that had previously focused on consumer goods were now creating campaigns for prescription medications. They brought sophisticated marketing techniques, market segmentation, psychological persuasion, emotional appeals to pharmaceutical advertising. The result was advertising that was more effective at influencing both physicians and patients than anything the pharmaceutical industry had produced before. These techniques would be refined and applied even more aggressively with benzodiazepines. Consumer credit and financing options made medication more accessible during this period. People who might not have been able to afford monthly prescriptions could now use various payment arrangements to obtain their medications. Pharmacies sometimes offered payment plans, and the growth of credit cards meant that people could charge their prescriptions. This financialization of healthcare consumption removed economic barriers that might otherwise have limited tranquilizer use. The psychological research community was both contributing to and being influenced by the tranquilizer phenomenon. Psychologists studying anxiety were using the medications as research tools, trying to understand the relationship between brain chemistry and emotional states. The availability of drugs that could reliably modulate anxiety provided new research opportunities, but the research was also being shaped by pharmaceutical interests, with industry funding often directing what questions were asked and how results were interpreted. Family dynamics were being altered by tranquilizer use in ways that are difficult to quantify, but undoubtedly significant. When a mother was taking daily tranquilizers to manage her anxiety, it affected her interactions with her children, her relationship with her spouse, the emotional tone of the household. Children growing up in homes where pharmaceutical mood management was normal internalized these patterns, learning that emotional distress was something to be medicated rather than processed. These learned behaviors would shape their own adult approaches to mental health. The baby boom generation, those children born between 1946 and 1964, was coming of age during the peak of tranquilizer use. They witnessed their parents' reliance on these medications, absorbed the cultural messages about anxiety and treatment, and formed attitudes that would influence their own later drug use patterns. When this generation encountered recreational drugs in the 1960s and 70s, they brought with them a fundamental comfort with chemical mood alteration that had been normalized by their parents' tranquilizer use. The line between medical and recreational drug use was blurred in their minds because they'd grown up seeing drugs used for lifestyle enhancement. The religious response to the tranquilizer epidemic varied considerably across denominations and communities. Some religious leaders embraced these medications as God's gifts for alleviating suffering, seeing no conflict between faith and pharmacology. They might even prescribe them to their congregants, recommending that troubled parishioners see their doctors about their anxieties. Other religious figures were deeply troubled by mass medication, viewing it as evidence of spiritual crisis. They preached that true peace came from faith, not from pills, and that the tranquilizer epidemic represented a nation turning away from spiritual solutions toward materialistic ones. The feminist implications were becoming more apparent as the decade progressed. Critical observers noted that women were being prescribed tranquilizers at much higher rates than men, and that the medications were often being used to help women accept social roles that made them unhappy. Rather than addressing the structural conditions that made many women feel trapped and anxious, limited career opportunities, unfulfilling domestic expectations, lack of autonomy, society was offering them pills to make them comfortable with their situation. This pharmaceutical management of women's distress was a form of social control, though it wasn't typically described in those terms at the time. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum during this period, and it's worth considering the tranquilizer epidemic in that context. African Americans had limited access to these medications due to healthcare disparities and economic barriers. Black communities generally couldn't participate in the mass medication phenomenon that was reshaping white middle-class America. This meant they were spared some of the dependency problems that would emerge, but they also lacked access to treatments that, despite their problems, did provide relief for some people. The racial dimensions of pharmaceutical access reflected broader patterns of healthcare inequality. International pharmaceutical companies were watching American consumption patterns with great interest, seeing the United States as a model for what might be achieved in their own markets. European and Asian pharmaceutical executives visited America to study the marketing techniques and prescribing patterns that had made tranquilizers so successful. They would apply these lessons in their home countries, though with varying degrees of success depending on local conditions. The American tranquilizer epidemic was becoming a template for global pharmaceutical marketing. The literary world was reflecting on the tranquilizer phenomenon, with novelists and poets incorporating these medications into their work. These weren't necessarily critical treatments. Sometimes tranquilizers appeared in fiction as just another aspect of contemporary life, as unremarkable as television sets or automobiles. The fact that serious literature was depicting tranquilizer use without comment indicated how normalized the practice had become. When something appears in fiction as background detail rather than controversial subject, you know it's been fully absorbed into the culture. The architecture and design of this period even reflected tranquilizer influence in subtle ways. The mid-century modern aesthetic, with its clean lines and calming colors, was designed to reduce visual stress and promote tranquility. Interior designers spoke of creating peaceful and serene home environments, using design principles that aligned with the tranquilizing ethos of the time. Whether this was direct influence or parallel cultural movement is debatable, but the emphasis on designed calm resonated with the pharmaceutical calm that millions were consuming daily. Let's return to Leo Sternbach's story for a moment, because his journey from forgotten laboratory compound to revolutionary discovery deserves more attention. Sternbach had been a refugee from Nazi-occupied Europe, eventually finding his way to the United States and employment at Roche. His training in organic chemistry was exceptional, and he brought to his work both rigorous methodology and creative thinking. When he undertook the project to develop new tranquilizers, he drew on knowledge he'd accumulated over years of research in Europe. The class of compounds he chose to investigate, the benjeptoxdiazines, was an unusual choice that reflected his deep understanding of chemical structures. Most researchers would have focused on modifications of existing successful compounds, but Sternbach took a more creative approach, investigating chemical families that hadn't been thoroughly explored for psychoactive properties. This willingness to pursue unconventional paths would ultimately lead to his breakthrough, though it almost cost him his job when the project seemed to be failing. The compound that would become chlordiazepine had actually been synthesized in 1955, nearly 2 years before it was tested. It had been set aside, mislabeled in Sternbach's records, and forgotten as he moved on to other variations. The fact that it was rediscovered during a laboratory cleanup is almost too perfect, a major pharmaceutical breakthrough emerging from mundane housekeeping. But such is often the nature of scientific discovery. The prepared mind, as Pasteur noted, is ready to recognize significance in accidents that others would overlook. When Sternbach finally tested the compound and saw its remarkable properties, he must have felt a mixture of excitement and perhaps some embarrassment at having overlooked it for so long. The testing itself was straightforward. The compound was administered to laboratory animals and their behavior observed. What Sternbach saw was clearly different from what he'd seen with other compounds. The animals became calm in ways that seemed qualitatively different from barbiturate sedation or meprobamate tranquility. They remained alert, responsive, coordinated, but demonstrably less anxious. The subsequent development work involved refining doses, testing different administration routes, and beginning to understand the compound's metabolism and safety profile. Sternbach worked closely with pharmacologists and toxicologists at Roche to characterize chlordiazepoxide thoroughly. They found that the compound had anticonvulsant properties in addition to its anti-anxiety effects, suggesting potential applications beyond simple anxiety relief. The breadth of effects would eventually make benzodiazepines useful for a range of conditions, from anxiety to epilepsy to muscle spasms to alcohol withdrawal. The clinical trials that followed were conducted at various hospitals and clinics, with physicians administering the compound to patients with anxiety disorders. The results were consistently positive, with patients reporting significant relief and physicians noting improvement in their patients' functioning. Side effects were generally mild, drowsiness, some coordination issues, occasional confusion, and seemed less problematic than those associated with barbiturates. The trials generated enthusiasm among participating physicians, many of whom were eager to have this medication available for their patients. The regulatory pathway for chlordiazepoxide was relatively smooth by modern standards. The FDA at that time required evidence of safety and efficacy, but the standards were less rigorous than what would later be required. The clinical trials that had been conducted were sufficient to satisfy regulatory requirements, even though they were short-term and couldn't capture long-term dependency issues. The FDA approved chlordiazepoxide in 1960, clearing the way for Librium's market launch. Roche's preparation for market launch was comprehensive and well-funded. They had watched Milltown's success and learned from both its successes and mistakes. Their marketing would be more sophisticated, their sales force larger and better trained, their advertising more carefully targeted. They positioned Librium not as just another tranquilizer, but as a genuinely superior medication representing pharmaceutical advancement. The marketing emphasized the drug's novelty, its improved safety profile, its effectiveness across different anxiety presentations. The initial prescribing of Librium reflected patterns established during the Milltown era, but with some refinements. Physicians who prescribed it were often those who had become somewhat concerned about meprobamate's dependency potential and were looking for alternatives. They saw in Librium a chance to continue helping their anxious patients, while potentially avoiding the problems they'd observed with older medications. Patient feedback was generally positive, which encouraged broader prescribing. Word spread through medical networks, with physicians sharing their positive experiences with colleagues. The financial success of Librium was immediate enough to validate Roche's investment in Sternbach's research. Sales grew steadily, and the medication quickly became one of Roche's most profitable products. The company's stock price reflected this success, rewarding investors who had bet on the tranquilizer market. The financial returns justified continued investment in benzodiazepine research, leading directly to the development of diazepam. Sternbach's work on diazepam involved systematic modification of the benzodiazepine structure to optimize its properties. He was looking for a compound that would be more chemically stable than chlordiazepoxide, which had some issues with storage and formulation. He also wanted something more potent so that smaller doses could achieve therapeutic effects. Through careful chemical work, he synthesized diazepam, which met these criteria admirably. The compound was more stable, more potent, and had a longer duration of action than chlordiazepoxide. The patent and proprietary considerations around these discoveries were significant. Roche's patents on benzodiazepines gave them exclusive rights to manufacture and sell these compounds, protecting their investment and ensuring that competitors couldn't simply copy their work. These patents would prove enormously valuable, generating billions in revenue over their lifetimes. The company was careful to protect its intellectual property, pursuing legal action against any potential infringers and working to extend their exclusive rights as long as possible. The competition between pharmaceutical companies intensified as the benzodiazepine market grew. Other companies attempted to develop their own tranquilizers, either by modifying meprobamate or by creating entirely new compound classes. Some of these efforts were successful, producing additional tranquilizer options for physicians and patients. But benzodiazepines' superior characteristics gave them significant advantages, and they gradually came to dominate the market. The medical education about benzodiazepines that physicians received during this period came largely from pharmaceutical company sources. Roche produced educational materials explaining benzodiazepine pharmacology and appropriate prescribing practices. These materials were distributed through pharmaceutical representatives at medical conferences and through medical journals. While the information was generally accurate, it inevitably emphasized positive aspects while minimizing potential problems. Physicians who relied on these materials for their understanding of benzodiazepines got a somewhat one-sided picture. Continuing medical education, which was becoming increasingly important for practicing physicians, often featured pharmaceutical company-sponsored programs on new medications. Doctors attending these programs could earn credits while learning about products like Librium and later Valium. The educational content was typically high quality, but the sponsorship created inherent conflicts of interest. Programs sponsored by Roche were unlikely to emphasize problems with their products. The patient experience of transitioning from meprobamate to benzodiazepines varied considerably. Some patients switched medication smoothly, finding that Librium or later Valium provided better relief with fewer side effects. Others struggled with the transition, particularly those who'd been taking meprobamate long-term and had developed tolerance or dependency. Stopping meprobamate to switch to a new medication could trigger withdrawal symptoms, something physicians were only beginning to understand and manage effectively. The dependency question that would eventually plague benzodiazepines was already being asked by astute observers during this early period. If meprobamate had proven to cause dependency despite initial reassurances, why should we believe that benzodiazepines were different? The pharmaceutical companies had answers: different mechanism of action, wider therapeutic window, more favorable safety profile. But these answers weren't entirely convincing to skeptics. Time would prove the skeptics at least partially right, as benzodiazepine dependency became a significant clinical problem. The role of general practitioners in the benzodiazepine era continued patterns established with Milltown. These primary care physicians were the main prescribers of tranquilizers, seeing them as useful tools for helping their many anxious patients. The 15-minute office visit, which had become standard, was poorly suited for the kind of careful psychiatric evaluation that might determine whether medication was truly appropriate. Doctors prescribed based on patient complaints and their clinical judgment, often without thorough exploration of underlying causes or consideration of non-pharmaceutical alternatives. The psychiatric profession's relationship with tranquilizers was evolving during this period. Psychiatrists had generally been skeptical of Milltown, viewing it as a superficial treatment that didn't address underlying psychological issues. Some maintained this skepticism toward benzodiazepines as well, but the effectiveness of these medications for symptom relief was hard to deny, and many psychiatrists began incorporating them into their treatment approaches. The field was undergoing broader changes as biological psychiatry gained ground against psychoanalytic approaches, and medications were increasingly seen as legitimate psychiatric tools. As we truly close this chapter, let's reflect on what we've covered. We've examined the staggering statistics of tranquilizer consumption. Billions of tablets consumed by millions of Americans, representing unprecedented pharmaceutical penetration of a society. We've traced the discovery and development of benzodiazepines, watching as Leo Sternbach's accidental discovery launched a new era in tranquilizer therapy. We've seen how pharmaceutical companies learned from Milltown's success and prepared to apply those lessons at even greater scale. We've considered the social, economic, and cultural implications of mass medication. The stage is set for what comes next, the golden age of Valium, when the tranquilizer epidemic will reach its full expression. The numbers we've discussed so far will be dwarfed by what's coming. The patterns we've identified will intensify and expand. The consequences we've hinted at will become undeniable. We're entering the most dramatic phase of this story, and everything we've learned so far prepares us to understand what happens when pharmaceutical success reaches its ultimate expression. So carry these numbers with you, the $7,500 growing to billions, the billion tablets, the 1 in 20 Americans. They're not just statistics, they're the foundation of one of the most significant pharmaceutical phenomena in history. The tranquilizer epidemic transformed American society in ways we're still grappling with today, and understanding its full scope requires appreciating both the human stories and the quantitative reality. We've done both in this chapter, and now we're ready to move forward into the Valium era, where everything gets even more remarkable, more problematic, and more revealing of fundamental tensions in how our society approaches mental health and pharmaceutical intervention. The quiet epidemic is about to get much louder, and you won't want to miss what comes next. But actually, let's not leave this chapter quite yet, because there are fascinating dimensions of the benzodiazepine discovery story and the consumption statistics that deserve fuller exploration. The way scientific discovery translates into mass consumption is never straightforward, and understanding these mechanisms helps us see not just what happened, but how it happened and why it happened the way it did. Consider the laboratory where Sternbach worked, the physical space where benzodiazepines were born. Roche's New Jersey facility was typical of pharmaceutical research laboratories of the era. Rows of benches equipped with glassware, instruments for chemical synthesis, balances for precise measurements, storage for thousands of compounds. The work was methodical and often tedious, involving the synthesis of compound after compound, each slightly different from the last, each tested for biological activity. Most compounds showed nothing interesting. Occasionally one would show promise but prove too toxic or unstable. The breakthrough compound that would become Librium was just one among hundreds that Sternbach synthesized, and as we've discussed, it nearly got overlooked entirely. The testing protocols used during this period were simpler than what modern pharmaceutical development requires. Animal testing involved administering compounds to mice, rats, or other laboratory animals and observing behavioral changes. There were standardized tests for sedation, anxiety reduction, muscle relaxation, anticonvulsant activity. Researchers would note which compounds showed activity, at what doses, and whether there were obvious toxic effects. The progression from animal testing to human trials happened more rapidly than it would today, and the human trials themselves were smaller and shorter. The informed consent processes for clinical trials were also less rigorous by modern standards. Patients were told they'd be receiving a new medication for their anxiety, and they consented to treatment. But the full implications of being an early user of an entirely new compound class weren't always clearly communicated. Patients trusted their doctors, doctors trusted pharmaceutical companies, and the whole system moved forward on that trust. When those early patients took chlordiazepoxide, they were indeed pioneers, though they may not have fully appreciated their pioneering role. The manufacturing scale-up required when a compound moved from laboratory synthesis to commercial production was substantial. Making a few grams of a compound for research is very different from producing tons of it for mass distribution. Roche had to develop manufacturing processes that could produce chlordiazepoxide consistently, safely, and economically. Quality control systems had to ensure that every tablet contained the proper dose and met purity standards. The infrastructure required was expensive, and Roche's willingness to invest in this infrastructure reflected their confidence in the commercial potential of benzodiazepines. The supply chain for pharmaceutical ingredients was global even in the 1960s. Raw materials for benzodiazepine synthesis came from various sources, requiring reliable suppliers and logistics systems. Chemical precursors had to be obtained, purified, and processed according to strict specifications. Any disruption in the supply chain could affect production, and pharmaceutical companies worked hard to ensure multiple sourcing options to avoid shortages. The complexity of pharmaceutical manufacturing was increasing, requiring ever more sophisticated management and oversight. The distribution networks for finished medications were also complex. Once tablets were manufactured, they had to reach wholesalers, who distributed to pharmacies, who dispensed to patients. Each link in this chain had its own economics and logistics. The system was designed for efficiency and reliability, ensuring that patients could obtain their medications consistently. When Librium and later Valium achieved massive sales volumes, these distribution networks were tested, but they generally performed well, getting medications to millions of patients across the country. The retail pharmacy experience during the Tranquilizer era had its own character. Pharmacies were often smaller and more personal than today's large chain stores. Pharmacists knew their regular customers and might notice patterns in their prescription fills. They were positioned to observe the tranquilizer epidemic at ground level, watching as more and more customers came in for anxiety medication refills. Some pharmacists were troubled by what they saw, the same customers returning month after month, year after year, their tranquilizer prescriptions renewed indefinitely. but they had limited power to intervene in prescribing decisions made by physicians. The economics at the pharmacy level were significant because tranquilizers represented reliable, high-margin products. Patients needed regular refills, ensuring steady repeat business. The profit margins on brand-name medications were substantial, making tranquilizers valuable inventory. Pharmacies that stocked and dispensed tranquilizers effectively built loyal customer bases around these prescriptions. The financial incentives aligned toward medication dispensing rather than questioning whether patients really needed long-term pharmaceutical treatment. The packaging and presentation of benzodiazepines reflected the era's pharmaceutical aesthetics. Pills came in characteristic bottles with child-resistant caps, labels listing drug name, dose, quantity, and prescribing information. The physical appearance of the medication, its color, shape, and size, became part of its identity. Valium's distinctive blue color in particular would become iconic, immediately recognizable to millions of users. The materiality of these medications, the actual physical pills that people held and swallowed, was important to their cultural presence. Let's also consider the statistical methodologies used to track tranquilizer consumption during this period, because understanding how the numbers were generated helps us interpret them properly. Prescription data came from various sources: pharmacy records, insurance claims, manufacturer shipment reports, physician surveys. Each source had limitations and potential biases. Pharmacy records might be incomplete. Insurance claims didn't capture uninsured prescriptions. Manufacturer shipments didn't track whether medications were actually consumed. Researchers triangulating between these sources arrived at estimates that, while not perfectly precise, were reliable enough to reveal the massive scale of consumption. The 1 in 20 statistic, for instance, came from surveys that asked representative samples of Americans about their medication use. These surveys had response biases. People might underreport tranquilizer use due to stigma, or overreport it due to social desirability effects. Researchers adjusted for these biases as best they could, but the figures remained estimates rather than precise counts. Still, even accounting for uncertainty ranges, the numbers were undeniably huge. Whether the true figure was 1 in 18 or 1 in 22, millions of Americans were regularly consuming tranquilizers. Demographic breakdowns of the data revealed patterns that we've discussed but that deserve emphasis. The gender disparity was stark. Women were receiving tranquilizer prescriptions at roughly twice the rate of men. This wasn't because women were necessarily more anxious. It reflected prescribing biases, help-seeking behaviors, and cultural assumptions about who needed these medications. When a woman went to her doctor complaining of nervousness, she was more likely to receive a tranquilizer prescription than a man presenting with similar symptoms. The medical system was systematically medicating women at higher rates than men. Age distributions showed that peak tranquilizer use occurred among middle-aged adults, with usage declining among the elderly. This pattern might seem surprising. Why wouldn't elderly people, facing health concerns and life transitions, be heavy tranquilizer users? Part of the answer was that the elderly population in the 1960s belonged to a generation that had different attitudes toward medication, having come of age before the pharmaceutical revolution. They were less likely to seek or accept psychiatric medications than younger cohorts. This generational effect would diminish over time as populations that had grown up with tranquilizers aged into their senior years. Socioeconomic patterns were pronounced. The highest usage rates were among middle and upper middle class populations, those with steady incomes, good insurance coverage, and regular access to physicians. Working class and poor populations had lower usage rates, not necessarily because they had less anxiety, but because they had less access to the healthcare system that dispensed tranquilizers. These disparities meant that the benefits and risks of tranquilizers were unevenly distributed across class lines, another way that the epidemic reflected broader social inequalities. Geographic variations in prescribing were interesting to epidemiologists studying the phenomenon. Some regions had prescribing rates significantly above the national average, while others fell below. These variations correlated with physician density, insurance coverage rates, cultural attitudes, and pharmaceutical marketing penetration. States with more urban areas, more physicians, and more progressive attitudes toward medical intervention showed higher prescribing rates. Rural states with fewer physicians and more traditional cultures showed lower rates. The geography of the tranquilizer epidemic mapped onto other geographic patterns of modernization and medicalization. The time trends in the data revealed the epidemic's trajectory. Starting from near zero in the early 1950s, tranquilizer use climbed rapidly through the middle of the decade, reached substantial levels by the late 1950s, and continued climbing through the early 1960s. The introduction of benzodiazepines created a new acceleration in the early 1960s, as the more potent medications encouraged even broader prescribing. The curves were almost exponential in their growth, each year showing higher numbers than the last. For pharmaceutical companies, these were exciting trends indicating expanding markets. For public health officials, they were concerning patterns suggesting loss of control. Comparing tranquilizer consumption to other health behaviors provides useful context. By the late 1950s, more Americans were taking tranquilizers regularly than were taking vitamins or engaging in regular exercise. The proportion taking tranquilizers exceeded the proportion being treated for many chronic conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure. Tranquilizer use had become one of the most common health behaviors in America, surpassing many practices that we might consider more fundamental to health maintenance. This comparison puts the epidemic in stark relief. International comparisons also illuminate the American situation. Per capita tranquilizer consumption in the United States exceeded that of virtually every other developed nation. European countries, while experiencing their own increases in tranquilizer use, didn't approach American levels. This American exceptionalism in pharmaceutical consumption reflected our unique healthcare system, our pharmaceutical industry's marketing sophistication, and our cultural receptiveness to medication solutions. The United States was leading the world in tranquilizer consumption, a dubious distinction that revealed something about our society's approach to anxiety and emotional management. The longitudinal aspects of the data, tracking individual users over time, showed patterns that raised concerns about dependency even before the term was widely applied to tranquilizers. Patients who started taking tranquilizers tended to continue, often indefinitely. Prescription renewal rates were very high, with few patients discontinuing their medications. This persistence of use could indicate that the medications were effectively treating chronic conditions, or it could indicate that patients had become dependent and couldn't stop. Distinguishing between these interpretations was difficult, and the pharmaceutical companies naturally preferred the first interpretation. The mortality data during this period showed increasing numbers of deaths involving tranquilizers, though still far fewer than barbiturate-related deaths. Overdoses occurred, particularly when tranquilizers were combined with alcohol or other medications. Some of these deaths were suicidal, others accidental, and determining which was often difficult for medical examiners. The numbers weren't alarming enough to trigger regulatory action, but they indicated that tranquilizers, despite being safer than barbiturates, weren't without serious risks. Hospital admission data showed increasing numbers of patients being admitted for tranquilizer-related complications. These included overdoses, withdrawal syndromes, paradoxical reactions, where the medication caused agitation rather than calm, and injuries sustained while impaired by medication. Emergency rooms were seeing patients who had mixed their tranquilizers with alcohol and become severely intoxicated. Psychiatric facilities were admitting patients whose tranquilizer dependency had become problematic. The healthcare system was beginning to deal with the consequences of mass tranquilizer use, even as it continued to be the primary vehicle for promoting that use. Research publications during this transitional period reflected the evolving understanding of benzodiazepines. Early papers focused on demonstrating efficacy and documenting favorable safety profiles. These were often published in prestigious journals and cited repeatedly in marketing materials. Papers raising concerns about potential problems were less likely to be published in top journals and received less attention. This publication bias meant that the scientific literature available to practicing physicians emphasized the positive aspects of benzodiazepines while underplaying potential concerns. Conference presentations followed similar patterns. Medical conferences featured sessions on the latest tranquilizer developments, often sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. Speakers presented data on benzodiazepine efficacy and safety, answered questions from practicing physicians, and generally promoted the medications. Critical perspectives were less prominent at these gatherings. Physicians attending these conferences came away with positive impressions of benzodiazepines, reinforced by the consensus apparent among their peers. The training of new physicians during this period incorporated attitudes toward tranquilizers that would shape prescribing for decades. Medical students learned that benzodiazepines were effective, relatively safe medications appropriate for treating anxiety. They learned prescribing protocols that emphasized addressing patient complaints with pharmaceutical interventions. They observed their clinical supervisors prescribing these medications routinely. The next generation of doctors was being trained in an environment where tranquilizer prescribing was normalized and encouraged. As we finally truly close this chapter, and I promise this is the actual ending, let's acknowledge what we've accomplished here. We've examined the tranquilizer epidemic through the lens of data and discovery, seeing how statistics revealed the massive scale of pharmaceutical consumption, and how Leo Sternbach's accidental discovery launched a new phase in that epidemic. We've understood that behind every statistic was a human story. Behind every billion tablets was millions of people seeking relief from their anxieties. We've traced how benzodiazepines emerged from laboratory serendipity to become the dominant tranquilizer class, positioned to exceed even Milltown's remarkable success. The numbers we've examined, consumption rates, prescribing patterns, demographic distributions, aren't just abstract figures. They're the quantitative expression of a cultural phenomenon, the numerical residue of millions of individual decisions by patients seeking help and doctors trying to provide it. Understanding these numbers helps us grasp the true magnitude of what happened during the tranquilizer epidemic, why it matters historically, and how it continues to influence our contemporary relationship with psychiatric medication. We're now fully prepared to move into the next phase of our story, the golden age of Valium, when all the trends we've identified will intensify, and when the tranquilizer epidemic will reach its ultimate expression. The benzodiazepines are ascendant. The pharmaceutical industry has learned to market these drugs with unprecedented sophistication, and American culture has thoroughly normalized psychiatric medication. Everything is in place for Valium to become the most prescribed medication in American history, and for the consequences of that success to finally become impossible to ignore. So let the numbers settle in your mind. The billions of tablets, the millions of users, the hundreds of millions in profits, and prepare yourself for the next chapter. The story continues, and it's about to get even more remarkable. The tranquilizer epidemic is in full swing, and we're just reaching the part where the stakes become highest and the implications clearest. Stay with me, because what comes next will challenge everything we think we know about progress, medication, and the chemical management of human emotion. The year 1969 marks a turning point in our story, the moment when the tranquilizer epidemic shifted from remarkable to truly extraordinary. Valium had been on the market since 1963, quietly building its user base and proving its effectiveness to physicians and patients alike. But something changed in the late 1960s, some combination of marketing mastery, cultural readiness, and pharmaceutical potency that catapulted diazepam into a stratosphere of consumption that had never been seen before in pharmaceutical history. If Milltown had been a bestseller, Valium was about to become something altogether different, a genuine blockbuster that would redefine what pharmaceutical success could look like. By 1969, Valium surpassed every other medication in prescription volume to become the most prescribed drug in America. Not the most prescribed psychiatric drug, or the most prescribed tranquilizer, but the most prescribed drug, period. More Americans were getting Valium prescriptions than were getting antibiotics, pain relievers, or blood pressure medications. When you consider the breadth of medical conditions that required treatment and the variety of medications available, having a single drug dominate all of them is remarkable. It's as if one particular restaurant became the most popular eating establishment in the entire country, serving more meals than all other restaurants, cafeterias, and fast food joints combined. The dominance was that complete and that unprecedented. The numbers from this golden age are staggering even by the standards we've already discussed. In 1970, American pharmacies dispensed roughly 2.3 billion Valium tablets. That's not a misprint. 2.3 billion individual tablets in a single year. The United States population in 1970 was approximately 205 million people. Do the math, and you get about 11 tablets per person per year for every man, woman, and child in the country. Of course, children weren't taking Valium, and many adults weren't either, which means that among actual users, the consumption rates were much higher. Some patients were taking 3 or 4 tablets daily, consuming over 1,000 tablets per year individually. The scale of consumption was simply breathtaking. The peak came in 1978 when Valium prescriptions hit their absolute zenith. By then, roughly 2.3 billion tablets were being prescribed annually, a number that had held relatively steady through the mid-1970s, representing a kind of saturation point where growth had finally plateaued. 1 in every 10 American adults was taking Valium or related benzodiazepines regularly. 10% of the adult population, that's not a fringe behavior or a small minority practice. That's mainstream, normalized, completely integrated into American life. If you were at a gathering of 10 adults in 1978, statistically speaking, 1 of them was taking Valium. At a dinner party of 12, At least one person at the table was probably on tranquilizers. The medication had achieved a level of market penetration that pharmaceutical executives today can only dream about. Roche, the company that manufactured Valium, was reaping extraordinary financial rewards from this success. The drug was generating billions of dollars in revenue annually, making it one of the most profitable pharmaceutical products ever created up to that time. Roche's stock price reflected this success, and the company poured resources into maintaining and expanding their market dominance. Their marketing budget for Valium exceeded anything that had come before in pharmaceutical advertising, and the sophistication of their campaigns set new standards for the industry. But the golden age of Valium wasn't just about the drug itself. It was equally about the medical system that dispensed it, particularly the family doctors and general practitioners who wrote the overwhelming majority of those billions of prescriptions. Understanding the role of these primary care physicians is crucial for grasping how the tranquilizer epidemic achieved such extraordinary scale. These weren't psychiatrists carefully evaluating patients for mental health conditions. These were general practitioners seeing patients with a wide range of complaints, from sore throats to chest pains to nervous conditions, and reaching for their prescription pads with remarkable frequency when anxiety was mentioned. The family doctor of the 1970s occupied a particular position in American healthcare that made them ideally situated to become the primary dispensers of tranquilizers. These physicians were the first point of contact for most patients, the doctor you saw for everything from annual checkups to acute illnesses to vague complaints that didn't fit neatly into diagnostic categories. They knew their patients and their patients' families, often having treated multiple generations. This familiarity and trust made patients comfortable sharing their anxieties with their family doctors, and it made doctors comfortable prescribing medications they believed would help. The typical family practice of the 1970s was busy, sometimes overwhelmingly so. A doctor might see 30 or 40 patients in a day, each appointment lasting 10 to 15 minutes at most. This pace left little time for the kind of thorough psychiatric evaluation that might determine whether medication was truly the best approach for a patient's anxiety. When someone came in complaining of nervousness, difficulty sleeping, or feeling overwhelmed by life's pressures, the doctor had to make quick decisions about treatment. Valium offered a convenient solution, a single pill that could address multiple complaints with a single prescription. Write the script, hand it over, move on to the next patient. It wasn't that doctors didn't care about their patients, they simply didn't have the time or training to provide the kind of comprehensive mental health care that might have been more appropriate. The training these doctors had received didn't particularly equip them for nuanced psychiatric prescribing. Medical schools in the 1960s and early 1970s emphasized diagnosis and treatment of physical conditions, with psychiatry often treated as something of a specialty sideline. General practitioners learned basic psychopharmacology, but not the careful evaluation of psychiatric conditions or the monitoring required for long-term psychotropic medication use. They learned that benzodiazepines were safe and effective for anxiety, that they had fewer risks than barbiturates, and that they could be prescribed with confidence. This training, combined with pharmaceutical company marketing that reinforced these messages, created a physician population that was comfortable prescribing tranquilizers broadly. The patient population that family doctors served during this period had its own characteristics that contributed to tranquilizer demand. The late 1960s and 1970s were turbulent times in American society. Civil unrest, political upheaval, economic uncertainty, cultural change, the Vietnam War and its aftermath. People were genuinely anxious, and their anxieties weren't unfounded. The stresses of the era were real and significant. When these anxious people visited their family doctors, they were looking for help managing their distress. The doctors, wanting to be helpful and having limited time and tools, turned to Valium with increasing frequency. Women continued to be prescribed tranquilizers at much higher rates than men, a pattern that persisted from the Milltown era. A woman visiting her family doctor with complaints of nervousness, irritability, or feeling overwhelmed was very likely to leave with a Valium prescription. The doctor might not inquire too deeply into what was causing her distress, whether it was an unhappy marriage, limited career opportunities, the burden of childcare with inadequate support, or genuine psychiatric illness. The medication was offered as a solution that could make her feel better without addressing underlying causes. This pattern represented a kind of pharmaceutical management of women's distress that feminist critics were beginning to identify and challenge. The physician-patient interaction around tranquilizer prescribing had its own dynamics worth examining. Many patients came to their appointments already knowing they wanted Valium, having heard about it from friends, seen advertisements, or read about it in magazines. They would describe their symptoms in ways they thought would lead to a prescription, emphasizing anxiety, sleep problems, feeling unable to cope. Doctors, who wanted to help their patients and who faced pressure to keep appointments brief, often complied with these requests. The prescription became almost a ritualized exchange, with both parties playing their expected roles. Some patients became quite skilled at presenting their symptoms in ways that maximized their chances of getting prescriptions. They learned which phrases to use, which symptoms to emphasize, how to appear appropriately distressed without seeming too dramatic. This wasn't necessarily manipulative in a malicious sense. These were often people who genuinely felt they needed the medication and were simply trying to communicate their needs effectively. But the dynamic meant that patient demand was driving prescribing as much as physician judgment, creating a consumer-driven approach to psychiatric medication that troubled some observers. The pharmaceutical marketing that supported this prescribing was sophisticated and pervasive. Roche's advertisements in medical journals were works of persuasion art, featuring carefully chosen imagery and language designed to encourage liberal prescribing. A typical ad might show a stressed-looking person, often a woman, often in a domestic setting, looking overwhelmed by life's demands. The accompanying text would describe how Valium could help patients cope with the stress of everyday living, or the anxiety that accompanies life's challenges. The messaging positioned Valium not as a treatment for mental illness, but as a tool for managing normal life stresses, which dramatically expanded the potential patient population. These advertisements were ubiquitous in medical journals during the Valium years. Doctors flipping through their professional publications would encounter Valium ads multiple times, each one reinforcing messages about the drug's safety and broad applicability. The cumulative effect of this advertising was significant, shaping physician attitudes and prescribing behaviors in ways that doctors themselves might not have fully recognized. They were being marketed to with techniques refined over decades of consumer advertising, and the marketing was working. Pharmaceutical sales representatives played a crucial role in the Valium ecosystem. These representatives visited doctors' offices regularly, bringing samples of Valium, leaving promotional materials and engaging physicians in conversations about the medication. They were trained communicators who knew how to address physician concerns, emphasize benefits, and minimize risks. Their visits served multiple purposes: maintaining relationships with prescribing physicians, introducing the product to new doctors, providing what appeared to be objective information about Valium's uses and safety. In reality, of course, their information was anything but objective, designed as it was to maximize prescriptions. The samples these representatives left were particularly effective marketing tools. Doctors could give Valium samples directly to patients, allowing them to try the medication without a prescription. If the patient liked how they felt on Valium, and most did since the drug was genuinely effective at reducing anxiety, they would return asking for prescriptions. The sample system essentially created a try-before-you-buy model for psychiatric medication, reducing barriers to initial use. Once someone had experienced Valium's calming effects, they often became long-term users. Medical conferences during this period featured extensive pharmaceutical company presence. Roche and other tranquilizer manufacturers sponsored symposiums, provided educational materials, hosted receptions, and generally maintained high visibility among attending physicians. These conferences were opportunities for doctors to learn about new developments in medicine, but they were also marketing venues where pharmaceutical messages could be delivered to receptive audiences. The line between education and promotion was blurry, and pharmaceutical companies exploited this ambiguity skillfully. The continuing medical education system, which required doctors to earn educational credits to maintain their licenses, became another channel for pharmaceutical marketing. Drug companies sponsored educational programs that, while providing legitimate medical information, also promoted their products. A doctor attending a CME program on anxiety disorders sponsored by Roche would learn about benzodiazepine therapy in ways that emphasized its benefits. These programs were technically educational, but their pharmaceutical sponsorship created inherent conflicts of interest that influenced their content. The office practice environment of the 1970s family doctor contributed to prescribing patterns in subtle ways. The prescription pad sat right there on the desk, a convenient tool for concluding appointments and sending patients away with something tangible. Writing a prescription felt like doing something, like providing help. Doctors are trained to help people, and giving someone a prescription that would make them feel better satisfied that instinct. The alternative, Telling a patient that their anxiety was a normal response to life circumstances and that they should try to cope without medication was less satisfying for both parties and took more time to explain. The reimbursement structures of the healthcare system also played a role. Doctors were paid per patient visit, creating incentives to see more patients in less time. Long, in-depth conversations about anxiety and its management took time that wasn't well compensated. Brief visits ending in prescriptions were more efficient financially. This isn't to say that doctors were consciously choosing money over patient welfare. Most weren't thinking in those terms. But the system's incentives shaped behavior in ways that favored pharmaceutical solutions over more time-intensive approaches. Patient expectations had been thoroughly shaped by pharmaceutical marketing directed at them. While direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription medications wasn't yet the television phenomenon it would later become, Valium had achieved such cultural prominence that people knew about it regardless. Magazine articles discussed the medication, characters in movies and television shows referenced it, friends and neighbours talked about it. People arrived at their doctor's offices with preformed ideas about what they needed, and those ideas often included Valium. This demand-side pressure on physicians was significant, as patients who didn't receive expected prescriptions might seek other doctors who would provide them. The repeat prescription system that evolved during the Valium years made long-term use almost automatic. Once a patient was started on Valium, they could typically get refills without seeing the doctor each time. A phone call to the office, a request for a refill, and the prescription would be called into the pharmacy. Patients didn't have to justify continued use or demonstrate ongoing need. The assumption was that if the medication had been appropriate initially, it remained appropriate indefinitely. This system made chronic use easy while making discontinuation difficult, as stopping would require actively deciding to change the established pattern. Some family doctors became uncomfortable with their role as tranquilizer dispensers, recognizing that they were prescribing these medications to enormous numbers of patients with little oversight. These concerned physicians worried about dependency, questioned whether they were helping or enabling, wondered if they should be doing more thorough psychiatric evaluations. But changing prescribing patterns meant swimming against powerful currents. Patient expectations, pharmaceutical marketing, peer practices, time pressures. Doctors who tried to prescribe more conservatively often faced patient complaints and pressure to conform to community standards. Medical malpractice concerns paradoxically contributed to liberal prescribing. A doctor who prescribed Valium for a patient's anxiety and the patient felt better was unlikely to face liability issues. A doctor who refused to prescribe and the patient subsequently suffered some adverse outcome related to their untreated anxiety might face criticism or lawsuits. The path of least resistance legally, as well as practically, was to prescribe. Defensive medicine pushed in the same direction as other factors, toward more medication rather than less. The geographic variations in Valium prescribing during this golden age revealed interesting patterns. Urban areas with higher physician density showed higher prescribing rates, as did affluent communities with good insurance coverage. Some regions had prescribing rates significantly above the national average, while others fell below. These variations partly reflected physician attitudes. Some medical communities were more conservative about psychotropic prescribing than others. They also reflected patient populations and their culturally shaped expectations about medical care. States with stricter prescription monitoring showed somewhat lower benzodiazepine prescribing than states without such systems, suggesting that oversight could influence physician behavior. However, monitoring systems were limited in scope and enforcement during this period, so their effect was modest. Most physicians could prescribe as they saw fit without meaningful oversight, and they saw fit to prescribe liberally. The age distribution of Valium users was broad but concentrated in certain demographics. Middle-aged adults remained the heaviest users, but the medication was also being prescribed to young adults and increasingly to elderly patients. College students stressed about exams, young mothers overwhelmed by childcare demands, middle-aged professionals dealing with career pressures, elderly people facing health concerns and life transitions, all were receiving Valium prescriptions. The breadth of the patient population reflected the breadth of conditions for which the medication was being prescribed. The psychosomatic complaint became a particular target for Valium prescribing. When patients came to their family doctors with physical symptoms that didn't have clear organic causes, headaches, stomach problems, fatigue, chest pain, doctors often suspected anxiety as the underlying cause. These psychosomatic presentations, where emotional distress manifested as physical symptoms, were common in primary care settings. Rather than leaving patients without treatment or engaging in lengthy exploration of psychosocial stresses, Doctors would often prescribe Valium, reasoning that if anxiety was causing the physical symptoms, treating the anxiety should resolve them. This approach sometimes worked remarkably well. Patients whose headaches had been driven by tension and anxiety found that their symptoms improved on Valium. Those whose stomach problems had been stress-related experienced relief. The medication's effectiveness for these conditions reinforced physicians' confidence in prescribing it broadly. If Valium could help with so many different presentations, why not use it liberally? The logic was seductive, even if it glossed over concerns about long-term medication use and dependency. The family doctor's role as counselor and confidant to their patients meant they heard about all manner of life stresses, marital problems, financial difficulties, job pressures, family conflicts. These conversations happened quickly during brief appointments, with doctors trying to be helpful and supportive while managing their time. Offering Valium became a way to provide something concrete, a tangible response to distress. The doctor couldn't fix the patient's marriage or solve their financial problems, but they could provide medication that would help the patient feel less overwhelmed by these issues. It was a limited solution, but it was something. Some physicians developed prescribing patterns that would raise eyebrows today. Stories circulated of doctors who prescribed Valium to virtually every patient who mentioned any form of distress. These heavy prescribers weren't necessarily unethical. They genuinely believed they were helping their patients. But their practices contributed significantly to the overall consumption numbers. A single family doctor might have dozens or even hundreds of patients on long-term Valium, each receiving regular refills, each contributing to those billions of tablets consumed annually. The doctor-patient relationship around long-term Valium use developed its own character. Patients came to depend on their medication, and by extension on the doctor who provided it. This dependency could strengthen the doctor-patient bond, but also created complications. Patients might be reluctant to raise concerns about their medication use with the very doctor who prescribed it, fearing the prescription might be discontinued. Doctors might avoid confronting problematic use patterns to maintain the relationship. The medication became central to the relationship dynamic in ways that weren't always healthy. Medical literature during the golden age of Valium reflected mainstream views about benzodiazepine prescribing. Journal articles discussed anxiety disorders and their treatment, generally endorsing benzodiazepines as first-line therapy. Treatment guidelines, such as they existed at the time, supported prescribing these medications for various anxiety presentations. Case reports described successful outcomes, reinforcing positive impressions. Critical perspectives were present but marginalized, appearing in specialty journals or being delivered at conferences without gaining mainstream traction. The pharmaceutical companies actively cultivated relationships with physician opinion leaders, prominent doctors whose views carried weight in the medical community. These opinion leaders would speak at conferences, write articles, and generally advocate for benzodiazepine use. Their endorsement provided legitimacy and encouraged other physicians to prescribe confidently. The system was mutually beneficial. Opinion leaders received speaking fees, travel support, and professional recognition, while pharmaceutical companies received powerful advocates for their products. Nursing staff in family practice settings played their own role in the tranquilizer ecosystem. Nurses often handled patient phone calls requesting refills, processed prescription requests, and sometimes made preliminary assessments of patient needs. Their familiarity with patients and their problems meant they were often advocates for continued prescriptions, telling physicians that Mrs. Jones needed her Valium refill or that Mr. Smith was having trouble sleeping again. These nursing interventions, while well-intentioned, added another layer supporting medication continuity. The pharmacy profession during this period was largely passive regarding tranquilizer prescribing. Pharmacists filled prescriptions as written by doctors, rarely questioning the wisdom of long-term benzodiazepine use or noting patterns of increasing doses. They were positioned to observe the epidemic at ground level, seeing the same patients month after month picking up their Valium. But professional norms discouraged them from interfering with physician prescribing decisions. Their role was to dispense medications accurately and safely, not to second-guess doctors' judgments. Insurance coverage for Valium prescriptions was generally good during the Golden Age, making the medication accessible to those with health coverage. The financial barrier to use was relatively low, removing one potential limiting factor on consumption. Insurance companies were paying millions of dollars annually for tranquilizer prescriptions, costs that were distributed across all policyholders through premiums. Some insurance executives questioned whether this represented appropriate use of healthcare resources, but these concerns didn't translate into coverage restrictions during the peak years. The family doctor's evening and weekend call responsibilities added another dimension to tranquilizer prescribing. Patients who had anxiety spikes outside of office hours would call their doctors, describe their distress, and often receive phone-in prescriptions for Valium. The convenience of this system meant that medications could be obtained quickly, without in-person evaluation. Doctors, wanting to help their suffering patients and wanting to resolve the call, would provide prescriptions readily. This after-hours prescribing contributed to overall consumption and reduced the barriers to initial use. Hospital admissions for tranquilizer-related issues were increasing during the Golden Age, though they remained a small percentage of overall admissions. Emergency departments saw patients who had overdosed on Valium, often in combination with alcohol. They treated patients experiencing paradoxical reactions, agitation rather than calm, from their medications. They managed withdrawal syndromes in patients who had abruptly stopped long-term use. These medical complications were warning signs that the tranquilizer epidemic was causing harm, but they weren't yet visible enough to change mainstream prescribing practices. The Golden Age of Valium coincided with significant social changes that influenced both anxiety levels and attitudes toward pharmaceutical treatment. The women's movement was challenging traditional gender roles, creating both liberation and anxiety for many women. The economic shocks of the 1970s, inflation, oil crises, recession, generated financial anxiety across the population. The aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate created disillusionment with institutions. All of these factors contributed to a population that was genuinely anxious and looking for relief. Valium offered that relief, however imperfect and potentially problematic. The countercultural attitudes of the late 1960s and early 1970s created interesting contradictions around pharmaceutical use. Young people who rejected mainstream values and embraced recreational drugs were often critical of prescription medication dependency among their parents. Mother's Little Helper, the nickname for tranquilizers immortalized in the Rolling Stones song, captured this generational tension. Younger people saw older generations as hypocritically dependent on legal drugs while criticizing illegal drug use. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, though it didn't significantly change prescribing patterns. As the 1970s progressed and Valium consumption remained at peak levels, concerns about benzodiazepine dependency began accumulating. Medical journals published increasing numbers of case reports describing patients who had become dependent on their medications, who experienced withdrawal symptoms when they tried to stop, who needed ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effects. These reports were concerning but hadn't yet reached critical mass. The medical profession's overall stance remained favorable toward benzodiazepines, even as troubling evidence accumulated in plain sight. The Golden Age began showing signs of waning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, as concerns about dependency became harder to ignore. Medical conferences started featuring sessions on benzodiazepine problems, alongside sessions on their benefits. Medical education began including information about dependency risks. Some physicians started prescribing more cautiously, limiting duration of use, or being more selective about which patients received benzodiazepines. These changes were gradual and incomplete, but they mark the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. The family doctor's role would evolve as attitudes toward tranquilizer prescribing shifted. Physicians who had been comfortable writing liberal Valium prescriptions began reconsidering their practices. They started seeing patients who had been on benzodiazepines for years and couldn't stop, whose lives revolved around their medication, whose functioning actually seemed impaired rather than improved by long-term use. These observations troubled conscientious physicians and contributed to changing attitudes. Patient advocacy groups began raising concerns about pharmaceutical dependency, adding their voices to the growing chorus questioning tranquilizer overprescribing. These groups represented patients who felt they had been harmed by medications they trusted, who had developed dependencies that disrupted their lives, who felt abandoned by a medical system that had prescribed so freely but offered little help discontinuing. Their testimonies were powerful counterpoints to pharmaceutical company claims of safety. As we close this examination of the Golden Age of Valium and the family doctor's role in creating it, we're left with a complex picture. The period from 1969 to 1982 saw tranquilizer consumption reach heights that remain remarkable in pharmaceutical history. Those 2.3 billion tablets annually, those 1 in 10 adults taking Valium, those billions in pharmaceutical revenue, these numbers represent a society that had thoroughly embraced pharmaceutical solutions for anxiety and distress. The family doctors who wrote those billions of prescriptions weren't villains in this story. They were well-meaning professionals trying to help their patients within the constraints of their practices, their training, and their cultural moment. They were responding to genuine patient distress with the tools available to them, tools that had been marketed relentlessly as safe and effective. That these tools turned out to have significant problems wasn't entirely their fault, though the medical profession would eventually need to reckon with its role in the epidemic. The patients who took those billions of tablets weren't weak or foolish. They were people struggling with real anxieties in turbulent times, seeking help from trusted medical professionals and trusting that the medications prescribed for them were appropriate and safe. That they became dependent on medications they'd been assured were non-addictive wasn't their moral failing. It was the predictable outcome of a system that promoted long-term pharmaceutical use without adequate safeguards. The golden age of Valium was, in many ways, the logical culmination of trends we've traced throughout our story. The medicalization of anxiety that began with barbiturates, the cultural normalization of tranquilizer use that Milltown achieved, the pharmaceutical marketing sophistication that developed through each drug generation, all of these came together in the Valium era to produce mass medication on a scale previously unimaginable. The family doctor, positioned at the intersection of patient need and pharmaceutical supply, became the critical conduit through which this mass medication flowed. As we prepare to move forward in our story, we'll see how the Golden Age gave way to reconsideration and eventual reform. The problems that were accumulating during the peak years would eventually become impossible to ignore, forcing changes in prescribing practices, regulations, and cultural attitudes. But those changes would be slow and incomplete, and the legacy of the Golden Age would persist long after Valium's market dominance ended. The Tranquilizer Epidemic reached its zenith during these years, but the story doesn't end with peak consumption. What comes next? The recognition of problems, the struggles of patients trying to discontinue, the medical profession's gradual acknowledgement of overprescribing, is equally important for understanding the full scope of what happened and what it meant for American society. We've seen the rise, now we'll see the complications that followed. The quiet epidemic was about to get much louder, as voices long silenced began demanding acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. Stay with me as we continue exploring this remarkable chapter in medical history, because the story's most dramatic turns are still ahead. But before we move on from the Golden Age, let's delve deeper into some aspects we've only touched upon, because the details reveal fascinating dimensions of how this medical and cultural phenomenon actually functioned in daily life. The doctor's office of the 1970s, for instance, was a specific physical and social space that shaped the interactions happening within it. Understanding that space helps us understand the prescribing patterns that emerged there. Picture a typical family practice office from 1975. It's probably in a medical building or a converted house in a residential neighborhood. The waiting room has vinyl-covered chairs arranged along the walls, perhaps a few magazines on a small table, some health education posters on the walls. Patients check in with a receptionist behind a sliding glass window, that ubiquitous feature of American medical offices that creates a physical barrier between staff and patients. The atmosphere is medical, professional, slightly intimidating for some patients. This is where people come when they're not feeling well, when something's wrong, when they need help. The examination rooms where patients meet their doctors are small, functional spaces. There's an examination table covered with crinkly paper, a couple of chairs, a cabinet with supplies, a desk where the doctor sits to write prescriptions. Medical instruments hang on the wall, an otoscope, a blood pressure cuff, a wall-mounted thermometer. The room is designed for physical examination, for the doctor to assess bodily symptoms and provide treatment. It's not particularly designed for the kind of intimate psychological conversations that anxiety treatment really requires. When a patient comes in complaining of anxiety or nerves, the consultation typically follows certain patterns. The doctor asks about symptoms, what the patient is experiencing, when it started, what makes it better or worse. The patient describes feeling overwhelmed, having trouble sleeping, feeling their heart race, experiencing unexplained physical symptoms. The doctor might do a brief physical examination to rule out medical causes, perhaps checking blood pressure, listening to the heart, palpating the thyroid. Then comes the prescription, the paper filled out with the magic words that will grant access to relief. The prescription pad itself was a powerful symbol during this era. That small pad with its coloured sheets and carbon copies represented the doctor's authority to dispense powerful medications. Handing over a prescription was a tangible action, a concrete response to suffering. The patient left the office with something in hand, proof that they had been heard and helped. The ritual of prescription giving satisfied both parties. The doctor had provided treatment, the patient had received care. Never mind that the entire interaction might have taken only 10 or 15 minutes, that the underlying causes of anxiety hadn't been explored, that long-term medication use hadn't been discussed. The prescription had been written, and that felt like progress. The waiting rooms of family practices during the Golden Age often held patients who were there primarily for medication refills. These weren't necessarily sick people in any acute sense. They were people maintaining their pharmaceutical regimens, stopping in to pick up their monthly prescriptions. Some had appointments, brief check-ins that would confirm the prescription was still appropriate. Others simply stopped by to request refills, which the doctor would authorize without seeing the patient. This steady stream of prescription-seeking patients became a significant part of primary care practice, consuming physician time and office resources. The medical records of the era provide interesting windows into prescribing practices. A patient's chart might show entry after entry of Valium prescriptions, months and years of continuous use with little documentation of why the medication remained necessary or whether alternatives had been considered. Progress notes might be brief to the point of uninformative. Patient doing well on current medication, continue Valium. These sparse records reflected the routine nature of tranquilizer prescribing and the lack of careful monitoring that characterized the era. The nursing staff in these practices developed their own relationships with long-term Valium patients. The nurse might be the one who first heard patient complaints about anxiety, who documented vital signs and symptoms before the doctor arrived, who handled phone calls requesting refills. These nurses often became patient advocates, supporting continued prescriptions for people they'd come to know well. When Mrs. Henderson called saying she needed her Valium renewed, the nurse would pass along the request sympathetically, perhaps noting that Mrs. Henderson was a regular patient who relied on her medication. These nursing interventions added another layer to the system supporting ongoing prescribing. The telephone played a surprisingly important role in Valium distribution. Patients could call their doctor's office, explain that they needed a refill, and have the prescription called into their pharmacy without ever seeing the doctor. This convenience was appreciated by patients and efficient for practices, but it meant that medications were being renewed without any clinical assessment. A patient might be developing tolerance, experiencing side effects, or having problems with their medication use, and none of this would be apparent to a doctor who was renewing prescriptions by phone request. The pharmacy experience for Valium patients had its own routines. Regular customers knew their pharmacist and the pharmacy staff. They'd stop in monthly, hand over their prescription or have it called in, and receive their medication. The interaction was friendly but businesslike. The pharmacist might ask if they had any questions about their medication, but this was largely pro forma. The patient knew what they were getting. They'd been taking it for months or years. What questions would they have? The transaction was completed, the patient left with their bottle of pills, and life continued. The physical appearance of the Valium tablets themselves became iconic. Those characteristic blue pills, nicknamed Blue Bombers or Blue Vs in some circles, were immediately recognizable. The distinct color served marketing purposes, making the brand instantly identifiable, but it also created a kind of visual culture around the medication. People knew what Valium looked like, and that recognition was part of the drug's cultural presence. Other benzodiazepines had their own color schemes, but Valium's blue remained the most famous. The daily ritual of taking Valium became integrated into many Americans' routines. Wake up, have coffee, take morning Valium. Come home from work, have dinner, take evening Valium. Or perhaps just one tablet at bedtime to ensure sleep. These rituals varied by individual, but the pattern of regular pharmaceutical consumption became normalized. Taking daily medication for anxiety wasn't seen as remarkable. It was just part of life, like brushing teeth or eating breakfast. This normalization was complete to the point where not taking medication might seem more unusual than taking it. The social situations where Valium use came up in conversation reveal its cultural acceptance. Women at coffee clatches might discuss their medications freely, comparing doses, sharing experiences, recommending that friends ask their doctors about Valium. Men might mention their tranquilizers in passing when discussing work stress or family pressures. The medication wasn't hidden or shameful in many social circles. It was acceptable enough to discuss openly. This openness reflected the thorough normalization that had occurred, where taking psychiatric medication was seen as a sensible response to modern life pressures rather than a mark of weakness or mental illness. The family dynamics around Valium use varied considerably. In some households, one person's medication use was accepted and supported by other family members. In others, tensions arose around dependency,